I am Aaliyah, 35 years old, and I destroy corporate scandals for a living. I bury billionaire liabilities before the morning news even catches a whiff of a story. But nothing prepared me for the dead-of-night phone call from my father, whispering from a holding cell. "Honey," he stammered, his voice trembling so hard I could barely recognize it. "I am at the police station. Your sister-in-law beat me with a baseball bat, but she told the police I attacked her because I am mentally ill. And your brother just stood by and let it happen." When I walked into that precinct an hour later, the desk officer turned pale and stuttered, "Ma'am, I had no idea." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to step up and obliterate someone who underestimated your family. The shrill ring of my phone at 2:30 in the morning was a sound I usually associated with a panicked Fortune 500 executive. As a senior corporate crisis consultant, my entire career is built on handling disasters that happen while the rest of the world is sleeping. I am the person high-profile clients call when they are about to lose everything. But when I looked at the caller ID and saw my father's name, a completely different kind of dread washed over me. Calvin is 62 years old, a retired high school principal and the most gentle man I know. He never calls past 9 at night. I answered immediately, sitting up in the dark of my penthouse apartment. The background noise on the other end of the line was unmistakable. It was the echoing, hollow sound of a police precinct holding area. Then came his voice, broken and fragile. He told me that Chelsea, my brother Jamal's white wife, had struck him repeatedly with a decorative wooden baseball bat they kept in their hallway. He told me that when the police arrived, she immediately turned on the tears. She played the terrified, fragile victim to perfection, telling the officers that my father was suffering from severe early-onset dementia and had experienced a violent psychotic break. And the worst part, the detail that made my blood run absolutely cold, was that Jamal stood right beside her and agreed with every single word she said to protect his marriage and his social standing. I did not scream. I did not cry. In my line of work, panic is a luxury you simply cannot afford. I told my father to sit tight, say absolutely nothing to anyone in uniform, and wait for me. I hung up the phone and stepped out of bed. My mind shifted instantly from the role of a loving daughter to the apex predator of the corporate crisis world. I walked into my closet and chose my armor carefully. A pristine charcoal gray designer suit, a silk blouse, and sharp heels. There is a very specific psychology to how you present yourself to law enforcement in the middle of the night. You do not show up looking like a frantic relative. You show up looking like a multi-million-dollar lawsuit waiting to happen. While I dressed, I made exactly one phone call. It went to Elias, the most ruthless and brilliant civil rights attorney in the city. Elias is a man I keep on a very lucrative retainer for my corporate clients, someone who knows how to navigate the complicated and often prejudiced corridors of the justice system. I gave him the briefest summary of the situation. An unarmed 62-year-old black man with no criminal record arrested on the unverified tears of a 30-year-old white woman, despite having defensive blunt force trauma on his arms. Elias simply asked for the precinct address and told me he would meet me at the front doors in 20 minutes. The drive through the empty city streets gave me time to process the magnitude of the betrayal I was dealing with. My brother Jamal was 33 years old and had spent his entire life functioning as the golden child of our family. My father had sacrificed everything for him. Calvin worked double shifts and delayed his own retirement just to fund Jamal's expensive private university tuition, desperately wanting his son to have a better life. Meanwhile, I was the daughter who took out massive student loans, worked 80-hour weeks, and hustled my way to the top of the crisis management industry without asking my father for a single dime. Jamal always felt entitled to the best of everything, and his ultimate prize was Chelsea. Chelsea was the epitome of performative allyship. She loved posting social justice hashtags online and attending charity galas to show off how progressive she was, but in private she consistently weaponized her privilege. She loved the aesthetics of diversity, but despised the actual reality of dealing with black family members who did not cater to her every whim. Jamal was so desperate to assimilate into her affluent country club world that he constantly shrank himself to fit her expectations. But to stand by while she physically assaulted the man who gave him everything, and then watch as the police locked him in a cage based on a fabricated story about mental illness, was a level of cowardice I had never anticipated. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. Dealing with a lying sister-in-law was not a tragedy to me anymore. It was just a Tuesday. I was going to ruin them. I pulled up to the precinct just as Elias arrived in his sleek black sedan. He was impeccably dressed, carrying a leather briefcase that looked heavy with legal consequence. We did not need to exchange pleasantries. We walked up the concrete steps and through the heavy glass doors of the station in total synchronization. The precinct waiting area was bathed in harsh fluorescent light smelling of stale coffee and floor wax. Behind the high desk sat Officer Davis, a man looking thoroughly bored with his overnight shift. I stepped up to the counter, my heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. I stated my father's name and demanded his immediate release. Officer Davis barely looked up from his computer screen. He gave me a dismissive wave of his hand and launched into a tired, bureaucratic speech. He told me it was a domestic disturbance case, that Calvin was currently being processed for assault, and that I would have to wait until morning to speak with a detective. He used that specific, patronizing tone reserved for people he assumed had no power. I let him finish his little speech. Then I placed my business card on the counter right over his keyboard. Officer Davis glanced down at it, and I watched the exact moment the color completely drained from his face. My crisis management firm handles the public relations for the local police union. I have sat in rooms with his commanding officers and the chief of police mitigating disasters that could have ended careers. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew the kind of power I wielded in the city. "Ma'am," he stammered, stumbling over his words as he looked from my card back to my face. I had no idea. He is being held in the back. We were just following procedure based on the statements provided at the scene. Elias stepped forward, then his presence radiating absolute legal authority. "Procedure?" Elias asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You mean the procedure where you arrest a retired educator who has defensive bruising from a baseball bat on his forearms solely because a younger woman cried on cue? You skipped a basic physical assessment. You skipped a medical evaluation for an elder claiming assault. You bypassed every standard protocol because of implicit bias, and you are currently holding my client unlawfully. I am preparing a federal civil rights lawsuit against this department as we speak, and I will be naming you personally as the primary instigator of a false arrest." Officer Davis looked like he might actually be sick. He scrambled to his feet, apologizing profusely, muttering about how the responding officers must have misread the situation. He grabbed a set of keys and practically sprinted toward the holding cells in the back. Within 5 minutes, the heavy metal door swung open and my father emerged. He looked so tired, his shoulders slumped, and his left forearm was heavily bruised and swollen where Chelsea had struck him. Seeing the man who raised me treated like a criminal broke my heart, but I refused to let a single tear fall. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tight, whispering that he was safe now and that I had everything under control. As I supported my father's weight and turned toward the exit, I saw them. Jamal and Chelsea were sitting in the far corner of the waiting room. They had clearly been waiting to give their final statements to the detectives. Chelsea was wearing an oversized designer sweater, looking disheveled on purpose, perfectly curating the image of a traumatized victim. When she saw me walking out with Calvin, her eyes went wide with shock. She clearly had not expected me to get him out so fast, or to show up looking like I owned the building. Chelsea immediately snapped into her performance. She jumped up from her plastic chair and rushed toward me, forcing fresh tears to well up in her eyes. "Aaliyah, thank God you are here," she cried, reaching out to grab my arm. We were so terrified. His mind is just gone. He did not know where he was. He just snapped and came at me. We had to call the police for his own safety. I am so traumatized. I did not flinch. I did not yell. I simply looked down at the hand she had placed on my expensive suit sleeve. I stared at it until the silence became so suffocating that she slowly pulled her hand back, stepping away from me as if she had been burned. I looked right through her, rendering her entirely invisible. My gaze shifted to my brother. Jamal was hovering behind her, looking everywhere but at me. He was shuffling his feet, staring at the floorboards, trying to hide inside his own skin. "Aaliyah!" He mumbled, his voice weak and pathetic. "Dad is sick. You have to understand. We were just trying to get him help. He is not in his right mind anymore." I stepped closer to Jamal, leaving my father safely in Elias's care for a moment. The air between us was freezing. "You are a coward," I told him, my voice so quiet and steady that it echoed in the empty room. "You let this woman assault the father who gave you everything, and then you stood by while they locked him in a cage. You watched him bleed, and you validated her lies because you are too weak to stand up to a woman who uses you as a prop." Jamal opened his mouth to argue, to offer some pathetic justification, but I cut him off. "Do not speak," I said. "You do not have a father anymore. You do not have a sister anymore. All you have is her, and the massive mistake you made tonight. I want you to go home, Jamal. I want you to go home and try to sleep, because tomorrow I am going to wake up and I am going to dismantle your entire life piece by piece. I am going to strip you of everything you value, and I am not going to stop until you have nothing left but the lies you told tonight." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on them, taking my father gently by the uninjured arm. Elias opened the heavy glass doors of the precinct, and the three of us walked out into the cool night air. The city was quiet, but a storm was brewing. They thought they could discard my father like trash to protect their own secrets. They thought they could use his age and his race against him in a system designed to fail him. But they forgot that I am the one who writes the narrative in this city. They handed me the pen, and I was going to use it to write their absolute ruin. I was not going to let her control the narrative. We reached my car in the precinct parking lot. Elias gave a sharp nod and headed to his own sedan, promising to file the protective paperwork by dawn. I unlocked the doors of my SUV, and the heavy thud of the locks echoed in the damp night air. I helped my father into the passenger seat. The adrenaline that had kept him upright inside the police station evaporated the second the passenger door clicked shut. He leaned his head against the cold glass and let out a breath that sounded like a dry sob. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, turning the heat up to stop his violent shivering. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the climate control. I did not push him. In my line of work, you let the victim set the pace of the debriefing. When people are ready to spill the truth, they will, provided you give them absolute silence to fill. My father rubbed his face with his uninjured hand. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. He told me he was not confused. He told me his mind was perfectly fine. I told him I already knew that. I asked him what really happened in that hallway. He closed his eyes and the dam broke. He explained that earlier that afternoon, he had found a piece of misdelivered mail that Chelsea had been desperately trying to intercept for weeks. It was a statement from a secondary bank, an institution he had never done business with. He opened it because his name was on the envelope. What he found inside was a financial death sentence. Chelsea had illegally taken out a $150,000 line of credit against his home. The same home he had spent 30 years paying off on a high school principal's salary. She had forged his signature, bypassed the verification process, and funneled the cash directly into her own accounts. When he drove over to their house to confront her with the bank statement, Jamal was upstairs. Chelsea panicked. She tried to snatch the paper from his hands, screaming that he was invading her privacy. When my father refused to hand over the evidence and threatened to call the bank, her panic turned into rage. She grabbed the heavy decorative wooden baseball bat from the umbrella stand by the front door and swung it with all her might. My father raised his arms to protect his head, taking the brutal impact across his forearms. He fell backward against the console table. But Chelsea is nothing if not calculating. The second she realized she had just assaulted an elderly man, her survival instinct kicked in. She dropped the bat, pulled out her phone, and dialed 911. My father looked at me with tears spilling over his cheeks. He told me she started sobbing into the phone the second the dispatcher answered. She cried that her father-in-law had severe dementia and was attacking her. She claimed she had to lock herself in the bathroom to survive. And Jamal, my brother, the son my father had given his last dime to support, came running down the stairs. Jamal saw the bat. Jamal saw the bank statement on the floor. But when the police burst through the door, Jamal wrapped his arms around his crying wife and corroborated her entire fabricated story. He told the officers his dad was sick and needed to be detained for everyone's safety. I gripped the steering wheel until my fingers went numb. The absolute depravity of framing a black man as a violent psychiatric threat to cover up a felony financial crime was a level of evil that required a very specific kind of privilege. I put the car in gear and merged onto the empty highway heading toward my building. I told my father he was never going back to that house, and he was never speaking to Jamal again without legal counsel present. He nodded silently, staring out into the dark city. We arrived at my building 20 minutes later. I pulled into the secure underground garage and guided him up the private elevator to my penthouse. My home is a fortress. Keycard access, 24-hour concierge and security guards who know not to let anyone up without my explicit verbal authorization. I led my father to the guest suite. I pulled fresh high-thread count linens from the closet and turned down the bed. As I fluffed the pillows, the bitter history of our family dynamic bubbled up to the surface. My father had poured every ounce of his energy and savings into Jamal. Jamal was the golden child, the boy who could do no wrong. When Jamal wanted to go to a prestigious, ridiculously expensive private university to rub elbows with the elite, my father drained his retirement accounts to make it happen. I was the independent daughter. I took out student loans, worked graveyard shifts, and fought tooth and nail for every corporate contract I ever won. I never asked for a handout. I never needed saving. But Jamal always needed a safety net. Jamal wanted nothing more than to assimilate into Chelsea's affluent high society world, even if it meant shrinking his own identity. And now the son my father sacrificed everything for had gladly sacrificed his own father at the altar of his wife's vanity and greed. I walked back into the bedroom and held out my hand. I told my father I needed his cell phone. He looked confused but reached into his pocket and handed it over. I powered the device down immediately. I walked over to my safe, unlocked it, and pulled out a clean, untraceable burner phone. I keep specifically for high-profile clients who need to go off the grid. I handed it to him. I explained that Jamal and Chelsea were going to start calling texting and leaving frantic voicemails to control the narrative. They would try to manipulate him, guilt-trip him, and gaslight him into believing the police incident was a misunderstanding. I told him he was entirely unreachable from this second forward. He took the secure phone, laid his head on the pillow, and closed his eyes. I closed his door softly and walked into my home office. The space is dominated by a massive glass desk and 3 wide monitors. I poured myself a glass of cold water, sat down in my leather ergonomic chair, and cracked my knuckles. It was time to go to work. I opened my laptop and pulled up Chelsea's social media profiles. The sheer hypocrisy of her digital footprint was staggering. Her pages were littered with performative activism. She constantly posted quotes about systemic inequality, shared hashtags about supporting marginalized voices, and curated an image of the perfect progressive ally. She used her proximity to a black husband to shield herself from any criticism, wearing her marriage like a badge of moral superiority. Yet the moment she faced consequences for stealing $150,000, she weaponized the justice system against a black elder without a second thought. She knew exactly how dangerous it was to call the police and claim a black man was violent and unstable. She knew the statistics. She knew the risks. She just did not care. Her comfort and her secrets were worth more than his life. I opened my encrypted tracking software and began to build the digital dossier. I took high-resolution screenshots of every post, every timestamp, every comment she had made over the past 5 years. I archived her entire digital existence. In the world of crisis management, you do not just fight the lie, you destroy the credibility of the liar. I was going to let her build her false narrative. I was going to let her and Jamal dig their own graves in the court of public opinion. And then, when they felt perfectly safe, I was going to drop an anvil of forensic truth right on their heads. The sun was just beginning to peek over the city skyline, casting a pale gray light into my office. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was an alert from my media monitoring software. Chelsea had just gone live. I clicked the notification, my eyes narrowing as the video buffered. The war had officially started, and she had no idea the kind of artillery I was bringing to the battlefield. The video filled my laptop screen. Chelsea sat on the edge of her expensive linen sofa, wearing a beige, oversized cardigan that deliberately swallowed her frame. Her face was scrubbed completely clean of makeup. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun. She looked exhausted, fragile, and utterly terrified. It was an absolute masterclass in performative vulnerability. I watched her take a shaky breath, looking directly into the camera lens. She pressed her hands to her chest and began to speak in a soft, trembling voice. She told her thousands of followers that her family was going through an unimaginable private tragedy. She talked about the heartbreak of watching a loved one decline into the darkness of early-onset dementia. She used all the right buzzwords. She talked about the burden on caregivers, the sudden mood swings, and the tragedy of losing the man she had come to view as a second father. Then came the pivot. She wiped away a single, perfectly timed tear and claimed that earlier that evening, Calvin had experienced a severe, violent, psychotic break. She described being trapped in her own home, fearing for her life as a man she loved turned into an unrecognizable threat. She praised the local police department for their swift and gentle intervention, claiming they had saved her from a fatal assault. The most infuriating part was her caption. She wrote a long paragraph about how mental illness is often ignored in minority communities, and how she and Jamal were dedicated to getting my father the psychiatric help he so desperately needed, no matter the cost. I scrolled down to the comments. The internet was eating it up. Hundreds of people were praising her bravery, sending prayers, and validating her victimhood. But the comment that made my stomach churn came from my own brother. Jamal had pinned his response to the top of the thread. He wrote that she was the strongest woman he knew, that his father's sickness was a tragedy, but that they would face this nightmare together as a united front. He was actively endorsing a narrative that framed our father as a violent criminal. He was using the very real systemic dangers that Black men face with law enforcement and weaponizing them to cover up his wife's financial crimes. I did not smash my keyboard. I did not scream. I systematically downloaded the high-resolution video file. I captured the URL, took screenshots of Jamal's comment, and archived every single response from their mutual friends. In corporate crisis management, we call this a preemptive strike. Chelsea was trying to get ahead of the story to establish herself as the victim before my father could expose her embezzlement. She was building a public defense strategy. The heavy chime of my penthouse intercom shattered the silence of my office. I glanced at the security monitor on my desk. It was my building concierge standing in the marble lobby downstairs. I pressed the intercom button. He informed me that a legal courier was waiting downstairs with a priority package requiring my direct signature. I told him to send the courier up. I walked to the front door of my penthouse and opened it just as the elevator doors parted. A nervous-looking courier handed me a thick, sealed manila envelope. I signed the digital pad, closed the heavy oak door, and ripped the envelope open as I walked back to my desk. Inside was a formal emergency notice from the law offices of Winston and Associates. Winston is a notorious family law attorney in this city, a man known for aggressive tactics and hostile asset takeovers. I scanned the first page of the legal filing, and the true depth of Jamal and Chelsea's depravity hit me like a physical blow. They were not just filing a police report to cover up a fight. They were filing an emergency petition for a medical conservatorship over my father. I read the legal jargon with laser focus. The petition claimed that Calvin was a danger to himself and others. It cited the fabricated police incident as primary evidence of his cognitive decline. They were requesting that Jamal be granted immediate and total legal authority over Calvin's medical decisions and his financial estate. The strategy was brutally efficient. If Jamal and Chelsea secured a medical conservatorship, they would gain absolute control over my father's bank accounts, his retirement funds, and the deed to his house. They could block me from viewing his medical records. They could force him into a psychiatric facility against his will. Most importantly, a conservatorship would give them the legal authority to completely erase the $150,000 line of credit Chelsea had stolen. They could bury the fraud under the guise of estate management, drain the rest of his savings, and legally silence him forever. It was not just a cover-up, it was a hostile takeover of a human life. Before I could even set the documents down, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently across the glass desk. The caller ID showed Aunt Valerie, my father's oldest sister. I knew exactly what was coming. Jamal was not just attacking on legal and public fronts, he was rallying the flying monkeys. I patched the call through my firm's secure recording system, which logs and timestamps every second of audio. I answered the phone with a calm, level greeting. Aunt Valerie did not bother with pleasantries. She came out swinging. "Aaliyah, what on earth are you doing hiding your father in that apartment?" she demanded, her voice shrill and accusatory. "Jamal just called me in tears. He said Calvin had a violent episode and nearly killed Chelsea. He said you barged into the police station, manipulated the officers, and took Calvin away before he could get the psychiatric evaluation he needs." I leaned back in my chair, my expression completely neutral. "And what exactly did Jamal ask you to do about it, Aunt Valerie?" "He asked us to intervene before you get your father killed or put in prison," she snapped. "You have always lived in a fantasy world, Aaliyah. You work too much and you do not understand what it takes to care for a sick elder. Jamal is just trying to protect the family. He found a beautiful memory care facility just outside the city. They have a bed ready for Calvin today. You need to stop being stubborn and hand him over to Jamal so they can get him the medical help he requires." I let her words hang in the silence. I gave her no ammunition. I gave her no emotional reaction to feed on. I simply asked her to clarify. "So to be clear, Jamal is asking the extended family to support him in forcing my father into a locked facility against his will. It is not against his will if he does not have the mental capacity to understand." "He is sick," she retorted blindly, completely sold on Jamal's gaslighting. "You are enabling him, Aaliyah. If you do not bring him to Jamal's house by noon, the family is going to support Jamal's petition in court. We will testify that you are neglecting his medical needs." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the legal documents on my desk. "Thank you for making your position entirely clear, Aunt Valerie. I appreciate you putting it on the record." I disconnected the call before she could scream another word. I dropped the audio file directly into a secure folder labeled Family Affidavits. My phone rang again instantly. This time it was Cousin Terrence. He is Jamal's best friend and a man who has never held a steady job in his life. I answered and initiated the recording. "Aaliyah, what kind of game are you playing?" Terrence barked. "Jamal just told me you are trying to steal Uncle Calvin's money. He said you locked him in your penthouse and cut off his phone so you can drain his accounts while he is out of his mind." The projection was so blatant it was almost laughable. Jamal was feeding the family a narrative that accused me of the exact financial crimes Chelsea was actively committing. "Jamal is a very creative storyteller, Terrence," I replied smoothly. "Did he happen to mention why the police released an allegedly violent, out-of-control man into my custody with 0 charges filed? Did he mention why my father has defensive bruising all over his arms?" Terrence scoffed. "He said you threatened to sue the cops because you think you are better than everyone else." Listen to me very carefully, Aaliyah. Jamal is the man of the family. He makes the decisions regarding Uncle Calvin's health. You need to step down and let Jamal handle his estate before we all come down to that fancy building of yours and handle you." I smiled, though my eyes were ice cold. "Are you threatening me, Terrence? Because I highly recommend you consult a lawyer before you show up at a highly secure building with the intent to harass a corporate crisis consultant." He cursed at me and slammed the phone down. I saved that audio file right next to Aunt Valerie's. They thought they were isolating me. They thought bringing the weight of the extended family crashing down on my shoulders would force me to fold. They assumed that because I was a single woman, I would buckle under the traditional patriarchal pressure of letting the male heir handle the family business. They had no idea that I build my career on destroying hostile stakeholders. I do not fold under pressure. I catalog it. I analyze the vulnerabilities of my opponents, and I prepare to strike the fatal blow. I stood up from my desk and walked down the hallway to the guest suite. I gently pushed the door open. My father was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall. The trauma of the night had settled deep into his posture. I walked over and sat beside him. I did not tell him about the smear campaign. I did not tell him about the conservatorship threat or the family turning against us. He did not need to carry that weight. "Dad," I said softly, my voice firm and reassuring, "I need you to put on your best suit. We have a very busy day ahead of us." He looked at me, confusion mingling with the exhaustion in his eyes. "Where are we going?" "We are going to the doctors," I told him. "I am going to introduce you to the top 3 neurologists and psychiatrists in this state. You are going to take every cognitive test they have. And by 5 o'clock this evening, we are going to have a wall of medical affidavits that will make Winston and Associates look like absolute fools." My father nodded slowly, trusting me completely. As he stood up to get dressed, I pulled out my phone and messaged my firm's lead forensic accountant. I told him to drop every corporate portfolio he was managing and immediately begin a deep dive dark web trace on Chelsea and Jamal. I wanted every credit card, every hidden bank account, and every wire transfer from the last 5 years pulled and categorized. The battle lines were drawn. They wanted a war over my father's mind and his money. I was going to give them a massacre. I left my father sleeping soundly in the guest suite, the heavy oak door completely shutting out the chaos of the night. I walked down the long shadowed hallway of my penthouse and stepped into my home office. The room was perfectly still, illuminated only by the panoramic view of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I poured myself a glass of cold water, sat down in my ergonomic leather chair, and woke up my multi-monitor workstation. It was time to build the weapon that would dismantle my sister-in-law. In my line of work, you do not just fight the lie, you destroy the credibility of the liar. You strip away their carefully curated public image until nothing is left but the ugly, undeniable truth. I opened my encrypted tracking software and pulled up Chelsea's entire digital footprint. The sheer hypocrisy of her social media presence was enough to make my stomach turn. Her biography on every platform read like a checklist of performative activism. It proudly declared her an ally, an advocate, and an anti-racist. Her grid was a meticulously curated gallery of aesthetic diversity. There were posts from years ago of her holding a Black Lives Matter sign at a sanitized permitted march. There were aesthetically pleasing graphics quoting James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, interspersed with photos of her sipping overpriced matcha lattes. But the most infuriating posts were the ones featuring my brother. Jamal was heavily featured on her pages, but never as an equal partner. He was positioned as a prop, a handsome, well-dressed accessory that she used to shield herself from any criticism. She constantly posted pictures of them at country club events or high society dinners with captions about protecting Black joy and building generational wealth. Generational wealth. I stared at that specific caption posted just 3 weeks ago and let out a cold, sharp laugh. She dared to type those words while actively draining the actual wealth my Black father had spent 4 decades breaking his back to build. I cracked my knuckles and went to work. I did not just take simple screenshots. Screenshots can be disputed. A defense lawyer will claim they are manipulated or taken out of context. I used enterprise-grade extraction software to archive the raw HTML data of her profiles, locking in the metadata, the timestamps, and the original image files. I created a secure cloud-based dossier, establishing an unbreakable chain of custody for the digital evidence. I started cross-referencing dates. My father had told me the fraudulent $150,000 line of credit was opened under his name exactly 4 months ago. I filtered Chelsea's posts to that specific month. The narrative of her theft unfolded across my monitors in high definition. 2 days after the bank approved the fraudulent credit line, Chelsea posted a video of herself unboxing a $10,000 Cartier watch. The caption read, "Hard work pays off, blessed and highly favored." A week later, she posted a photo dump from a luxury resort in Tulum, Mexico. She and Jamal were drinking champagne on a private yacht. Jamal looked so proud, entirely oblivious to the fact that his wife was financing their luxurious lifestyle with his father's stolen home equity. 2 weeks after that, she posted a video showcasing a massive top-to-bottom kitchen renovation in their suburban home. Custom marble countertops, imported Italian tile, and professional-grade appliances. She stood in the center of the kitchen, grinning at the camera, thanking her followers for supporting her interior design journey. I archived every single post matching the extravagant purchases to the exact timeline of the stolen funds. But the financial crimes were only half of the story. The true sickness lay in what she had done tonight at the police precinct. Chelsea understood exactly how the world worked. She understood the lethal historical danger of a white woman pointing a finger at an older black man and claiming she felt threatened. She knew the statistics. She knew the inherent biases built into the justice system. She knew that when the police arrived, they would see a crying, disheveled blonde woman and a large black man, and they would make their decision before anyone even spoke a word. She weaponized her whiteness and her tears without a second of hesitation. She used the very systemic racism she preached against online as a literal shield to cover up a felony. She was perfectly willing to let my father be thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and potentially harmed by law enforcement, just so she could buy herself time to hide her embezzlement. And Jamal let her do it. That was the betrayal that burned the hottest. Jamal stood in that police station, wrapped his arms around the woman who had just struck his father with a baseball bat, and validated her lies. He threw his own father to the wolves because confronting the truth meant admitting his perfect marriage to his perfect white wife was a complete financial and moral fraud. Jamal was so desperate to maintain his proximity to her privilege that he became complicit in his father's destruction. I created a new folder on my desktop and labeled it the Checkmate. I dragged the archived posts, the time-stamped metadata, and the cross-referenced timeline into the folder. This was not just a collection of social media updates. This was a psychological profile of a predator. Crisis management is all about anticipating the opponent's next move. Chelsea was arrogant, but she was not stupid. She knew my father had seen the bank statements. She knew the financial paper trail existed. Her fake 911 call was her opening move and attempt to discredit my father by labeling him mentally unstable. If she could convince the authorities and the family that Calvin was suffering from severe dementia, no one would believe his claims about the forged signatures or the missing money. They would brush it off as the paranoid delusions of a sick old man. She was laying the groundwork for a medical conservatorship. I could see the strategy forming with crystal clarity. If she and Jamal could get legal control over my father's medical and financial decisions, they could intercept his mail, drain his remaining assets, and lock him away in a facility where his voice would be permanently silenced. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow, deep breath. The quiet hum of the city outside my window was the only sound in the room. They thought they were playing chess against a retired high school principal. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who dismantles hostile corporate takeovers before breakfast. Chelsea wanted to play the fragile victim. She wanted to use the internet to build a false narrative of survival and duty. I was going to let her. In fact, I was going to give her all the rope she needed to hang herself. I would let her post her tearful updates. I would let her gather sympathy from her country club friends. I would let her believe she had completely outsmarted us. And then when she was standing at the absolute peak of her arrogance, I was going to drop this digital dossier on the table and watch her entire world shatter into dust. I closed the primary tracking software and opened a secure communication channel to my firm's lead forensic accountant. I typed out a quick, concise message instructing him to clear his schedule. I needed a dark web trace on Chelsea's financial history, specifically looking for offshore accounts, hidden debts, or illegal gambling activity. People who steal $150,000 from family members usually have habits they cannot finance through legitimate means. I hit send, closed my laptop, and watched the sun slowly rise over the city skyline. The game was set. The board was arranged, and I was holding every single winning piece. Sleep is a biological necessity, but in the middle of a corporate crisis, it is a luxury I strictly ration. I allowed myself exactly 4 hours. When my eyes snapped open at 7 in the morning, the penthouse was dead silent. The heavy blackout curtains blocked the rising sun, and the climate control hummed a steady, soothing rhythm. For a brief fraction of a second, my brain registered a normal Saturday morning. Then the memory of the holding cell, the baseball bat, and my father's bruised arms came rushing back with the force of a freight train. I rolled out of bed, tied my silk robe tight around my waist, and walked into the kitchen to start the espresso machine. My personal phone, which I had left face down on the marble island, was vibrating so consistently it was slowly inching its way toward the edge of the counter. I picked it up and tapped the screen. The notifications cascaded down my lock screen in a relentless waterfall. There were missed calls from cousins I had not spoken to in years. There were frantic text messages from family friends. There were alerts from Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Yes, LinkedIn. That is how you know a scandal has breached the containment zone of personal drama and bled into professional reputation. I unlocked the phone and went straight to the source. Chelsea had not just posted a status update, she had orchestrated a full-scale digital media campaign. The video was pinned to the top of all her social media profiles. It was a masterclass in manipulative public relations. If I had not been looking at the woman who assaulted my father, I might have been professionally impressed by the sheer calculation of her setup. She was sitting on the floor of her walk-in closet, a location specifically chosen to convey vulnerability and intimacy. She wore no makeup. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, and she was wearing one of Jamal's oversized college sweatshirts. The lighting was dim, casting soft shadows across her face, perfectly highlighting her pale skin and wide, frightened eyes. I pressed play, keeping the volume low so the sound would not travel down the hall to the guest suite. Chelsea took a deep, shaky breath before speaking. She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice cracking with practiced precision. "I usually use this platform to share home decor and lifestyle content, but today I need to talk about something incredibly difficult. My family is experiencing a devastating private tragedy, and because rumors are already starting to spread, Jamal and I want to control the narrative and just be honest with you all." I leaned against the kitchen counter and took a sip of my black espresso, my expression entirely stony. She was hitting every single public relations buzzword: transparency, controlling the narrative, honesty. She was establishing herself as the reliable narrator of a crisis she had manufactured. Chelsea wiped her cheek, though there was no actual tear to catch. "As many of you know, my father-in-law Calvin is the pillar of our family. But what we have kept private is that over the last few months his mind has been slipping. Early onset dementia is a cruel, unforgiving disease. Last night, the disease took over completely. Calvin suffered a violent, terrifying psychotic break in our home. He did not know where he was or who I was. He became aggressive, and for my own physical safety, and for his, we had to make the hardest phone call of our lives. We had to involve the police to stop him from hurting himself or me." I gripped the edge of the marble counter so hard my fingernails dug into my palms. The audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was taking the physical assault she committed, the defensive wounds she inflicted on a 62-year-old man, and projecting them entirely onto her victim. She was weaponizing the tragic reality of cognitive decline to excuse her own felony. But she was not done. She leaned closer to the camera, lowering her voice into a theatrical whisper. "Mental health and cognitive decline are so often swept under the rug, especially in the Black community. Jamal and I are committed to getting Dad the intensive locked facility psychiatric care he so desperately needs right now. Please respect our privacy as we navigate this nightmare. Keep us in your prayers." The video ended. It was exactly 3 minutes long, optimized perfectly for maximum algorithm engagement. I did not throw my phone. I simply scrolled down to the comments section. I needed to see how the audience was reacting, but more importantly, I needed to see what my brother was doing. It did not take long to find him. Jamal had pinned his own comment to the absolute top of the thread, ensuring it was the very first thing any viewer would read. I read his words twice, letting the absolute magnitude of his betrayal burn itself into my memory. "My wife is my rock," Jamal had written. Watching my father's mind deteriorate has been the greatest heartbreak of my life. I am devastated by his violent episode last night, but I am in awe of how Chelsea handled his psychotic break with so much grace and compassion. We love you, Dad. We are going to get you the psychiatric help you need, no matter what it takes. Thank you all for supporting my brave wife during this family tragedy. He validated the lie. Jamal, the golden child, the boy whose entire life was paved by Calvin's financial sacrifices, had officially signed off on the character assassination of his own father. He actively endorsed a narrative that framed a retired, respected black educator as a violent, deranged threat. He traded his father's dignity to protect his wife's vanity and his own proximity to her white privilege. I scrolled through the replies to Jamal's comment. The echo chamber was functioning exactly as Chelsea had designed it. Their affluent country club friends, her sorority sisters, and his corporate colleagues were flooding the timeline. You are so brave, Chelsea. Sending prayers to your family. Jamal, you are a wonderful son for taking charge of his medical care. It is so terrifying when dementia turns them violent. You did the right thing calling the cops. It was sickening how quickly and seamlessly society accepted the narrative. A fragile, crying white woman points a finger at a large black man and claims she felt threatened, and the entire world immediately falls in line to validate her fear. No one questioned it. No one asked for proof. They just accepted the premise that my father was a monster and she was a saint. But I am a corporate crisis consultant. I do not look at social media campaigns through the lens of emotion. I look at them through the lens of legal strategy. Chelsea did not post this highly edited, heavily scripted video just to get sympathy from her friends. You do not expose a private family crisis to thousands of followers unless you are building a public foundation for a legal maneuver. This video was Exhibit A. She was crowdsourcing a jury pool. She was establishing a digital time-stamped alibi for the bruises that were surely going to show up on my father's arms. If Calvin tried to tell anyone that Chelsea hit him with a bat, she now had a public record claiming he was suffering from violent delusions. More importantly, this was the bedrock for the emergency medical conservatorship. If they filed a petition in family court to strip my father of his financial and medical rights, the judge would look at this video. The judge would see a unified front from the son and daughter-in-law publicly pleading for psychiatric intervention. They were laying the groundwork to lock him in a facility, drug him into compliance, and drain the remaining equity from his home to cover her gambling debts and embezzlement. I locked my phone screen and set it down on the counter. The cold, calculated fury spreading through my chest was a familiar, comforting sensation. It was the feeling I got right before I walked into a boardroom and decimated an opponent's entire career. I walked quietly down the hallway and gently opened the door to the guest suite. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn tight. My father was still asleep, his breathing slow and steady. He looked exhausted, the stress of the holding cell having taken a physical toll on his face. His left arm rested on top of the duvet, the dark, angry purple bruises from the baseball bat clearly visible against his skin. I stood in the doorway and watched him breathe. I made a silent promise to him right then and there. I would not let them take his mind. I would not let them take his home. I would not let them steal his dignity. I pulled the door shut until it clicked softly into place. I walked back to my office, woke up my monitors, and began drafting the legal demands for the independent medical evaluations. Chelsea wanted to play games on the internet. Let her have her likes and her comments. I was preparing to fight in the medical records, the forensic bank statements, and the court of law. And when I finally dropped my receipts, the explosion was going to leave a crater where her perfect life used to be. I stared at the blinking cursor on my monitor, my mind already 10 steps ahead of Jamal and Chelsea. The emergency notice from Winston and Associates that had arrived via courier earlier was sitting on the corner of my desk like a live grenade. I reached out and pulled the thick stack of legal documents into the center of my workspace. I needed to dissect every single word they had filed. In crisis management, you never skim the opposition's opening volley. You read it until you find the structural flaw. Winston was a notoriously aggressive family law attorney. He was the kind of lawyer who specialized in messy divorces and hostile asset takeovers disguised as elder care. Jamal and Chelsea had clearly maxed out another credit card just to afford his retainer. The petition was filed ex parte, meaning they were asking a judge to grant them emergency temporary powers before my father or I even had a chance to present a defense in court. I flipped to the second page, my eyes scanning the fabricated evidence they had submitted to justify stripping a healthy 62-year-old man of his basic human rights. The petition was a masterclass in legal fiction. Winston had weaponized Chelsea's police call with devastating efficiency. The document claimed that Calvin had been exhibiting a rapidly escalating pattern of paranoid and violent behavior over the past 6 months. It stated that he was suffering from severe undiagnosed dementia and that last night's incident was the culmination of his cognitive collapse. They had attached a copy of the preliminary police report as Exhibit A, highlighting Chelsea's statement that Calvin had attacked her unprovoked. But the truly insidious part was Exhibit B. It was a sworn affidavit signed by my own brother. I read Jamal's statement, feeling a fresh wave of disgust wash over me. Jamal swore under penalty of perjury that our father had been losing his grip on reality. He claimed Calvin had been showing up at their house confused, misplacing items, and displaying uncharacteristic aggression. Jamal positioned himself as the heartbroken, dutiful son who was stepping in to make the agonizing but necessary medical decisions his father was no longer capable of making. I set the document down and rubbed my temples. The strategy was brutally transparent. They were trying to fast-track a temporary conservatorship by creating a false sense of immediate life-threatening danger. If a judge read these documents in a vacuum without any context or defense, they would sign the order before lunch. But this was not just about keeping Chelsea out of a jail cell for assault. The police report was merely the catalyst. The conservatorship was the actual endgame. I pulled up a blank digital whiteboard on my screen and started mapping out their hidden agenda. I draw these incident flowcharts for multinational corporations facing federal indictments, tracing the root cause of the liability to the ultimate financial motive. Now I was doing it for my own family. I typed out the word conservatorship in bold red letters at the top of the screen. Then I began drawing lines to the direct consequences of that legal status. If Jamal and Chelsea secured legal authority over my father, they would gain absolute control over his estate. That meant they would get the legal power to manage his bank accounts, his retirement funds, and the deed to his house. It also meant they could legally block me from viewing any of his financial or medical records. They could dictate where he lived, what doctors he saw, and who was allowed to visit him. They could lock him in a facility and ban me from walking through the front doors. But the most critical line on my whiteboard connected the conservatorship directly to the $150,000 fraudulent line of credit. The realization hit me with absolute clarity. This was a hostile asset takeover designed specifically to bury a felony. If Calvin retained his legal autonomy, he could walk into any bank branch tomorrow morning, contest the forged signature, and trigger a federal fraud investigation. Chelsea would be indicted. The bank would demand the money back, and their entire lives would collapse. However, if Jamal became the conservator, the threat of an investigation completely vanished. As Calvin's legal guardian, Jamal would have the authority to manage his father's debts. He could validate the fraudulent line of credit under the guise of paying for Calvin's new medical care. He could quietly absorb the debt into the estate, slowly drain whatever equity was left in the house to cover Chelsea's underground gambling losses, and completely sanitize the paper trail. A judge would inadvertently sanction the embezzlement because it would be hidden beneath layers of fabricated elder care expenses. Chelsea was not just trying to avoid an assault charge, she was trying to legally launder stolen money by burying the only witness in a psychiatric ward. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Elias. He answered on the first ring, his tone sharp and alert. He was already at his firm preparing the civil rights paperwork regarding the precinct from last night. "Elias," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "They hired Winston. They are moving for an ex parte emergency medical and financial conservatorship. They filed the petition first thing this morning, leaning entirely on the police report and a fabricated affidavit from Jamal." I heard Elias swear under his breath. "Winston is a shark. He knows exactly which judges to target for an ex parte order. If they get a temporary ruling, they freeze you out immediately. We need to counterfile yesterday. I am already 10 steps ahead, I told him. I am not letting them get in front of a judge without a brick wall of medical evidence blocking their path. I am drafting the demands for independent evaluations right now. But Elias, this is not just about the assault. This is a cover-up. Chelsea forged Calvin's signature and took out a $150,000 line of credit against his house. My father found out yesterday. That is why she hit him with the bat. And that is why they are rushing the conservatorship. They need legal control of the estate to launder the stolen equity. The line was quiet for a moment as Elias processed the magnitude of the financial crime. The stakes had just escalated from domestic assault to elder abuse and wire fraud. "Do you have the financial paper trail?" Elias asked, his voice dropping into the cold clinical tone he used when preparing for a high-stakes trial. "I have my firm's lead forensic accountant doing a dark web trace on her accounts as we speak," I replied. "But we cannot wait for the final financial report to block this petition. We need to strike the medical claim immediately. I need you to file a motion to halt the ex parte proceeding. Inform the judge that Calvin is currently residing in a secure location with his daughter, that he is in zero immediate danger, and that we are voluntarily submitting him to a comprehensive battery of neurological and psychiatric evaluations by top-tier independent specialists today. I will draft the motion and get it in front of the duty judge within the hour," Elias confirmed. "Winston is going to argue that you are holding an ailing man hostage to prevent him from getting help." "Let Winston argue whatever he wants," I said smoothly. The harder they push the narrative that my father is violently insane, the harder the backlash will be when I drop sworn affidavits from the best neurologists in the state, proving his mind is flawless. Winston is about to walk into a trap, and Jamal and Chelsea are dragging him right into it. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto my desk. The legal threat was real, and the timeline was incredibly tight. In a matter of hours, a judge would be looking at Jamal's fabricated affidavit. I needed to move fast. I stood up and walked down the hallway to the guest suite. The morning sun was now fully illuminating the city, but the curtains in my father's room remained drawn. I knocked gently and pushed the door open. Calvin was awake, sitting up against the headboard. The bruising on his forearms looked even worse in the daylight, deep purples and blacks blooming across his skin. "How are you feeling, Dad?" I asked, keeping my tone light and reassuring. "Like I got hit by a truck," he muttered, trying to offer a small, strained smile. "What is the plan for today, Aaliyah? I know you have that look in your eye. You are preparing for a fight." I walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. "I am preparing for a war," I corrected him gently. "Jamal and Chelsea just filed a legal petition to take control of your medical decisions and your finances. They are telling the court that you have severe dementia." My father's face crumbled. The betrayal from his son was a wound far deeper than the physical trauma on his arms. He raised a shaking hand to his face. "My own boy. He is trying to lock me away just to protect her." I reached out and took his hand, holding it firmly. "He is trying," I said, "but he is going to fail. I am not going to let them touch you. But to beat them in court, I need you to put on your best suit. We are going to see 3 different specialists today. You are going to take every cognitive test they put in front of you, and you are going to ace them. We are going to build a medical shield so thick that Jamal's lawyers will shatter their teeth trying to bite through it." My father looked at me, the fear in his eyes slowly being replaced by a quiet, determined resolve. He nodded. "Okay, baby girl, let us go to work." I gave his hand one last squeeze and walked back out to my office. The first phase of the counterattack was in motion. They wanted to use the law to steal his life. I was going to use the law to absolutely bury theirs. As Calvin finished dressing in the guest suite, my personal cell phone began to ring. I stared at the illuminated screen resting on the cold glass of my desk. The caller ID displayed Uncle Vernon. He was my father's older brother, a retired deacon, and the undisputed patriarch of our extended family network. In the world of corporate crisis management, we call this the proxy wave. When a hostile entity launches a smear campaign, they rarely fight you directly in the open. Instead, they weaponize your own ecosystem against you. They send in the flying monkeys. Jamal had clearly spent the entire morning working the phones, playing the role of the devastated son. He was mobilizing the family tree to apply overwhelming social pressure, hoping to break my resolve before the courts even opened. I did not silence the call. I reached across my desk, booted up my firm's enterprise-grade audio recording software, and routed my cell phone through the encrypted server. Every syllable would be time-stamped, legally admissible, and stored in a secure cloud vault. I pressed the answer button and greeted him with the perfectly modulated, emotionless tone I use for hostile press briefings. "Aaliyah, what in the world is wrong with you?" Uncle Vernon barked, bypassing any form of a traditional greeting. His voice was thick with self-righteous authority. "Jamal just called me in tears. He said you barged into the police precinct, manipulated the officers into releasing a dangerously sick man, and kidnapped your own father." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I did not interrupt him. The golden rule of handling a hostile proxy is to let them exhaust their initial burst of outrage. Silence makes people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people tend to overshare. "Did you hear me, little girl?" Uncle Vernon demanded, his volume rising. "Your brother is trying to protect this family. He is trying to protect Calvin from himself. Chelsea is completely traumatized. She had to barricade herself in a bathroom because your father lost his mind and attacked her. You are living in a state of absolute denial if you think you can handle a man with violent dementia by yourself." I kept my breathing steady. The casual way my own uncle accepted the narrative of my father being a violent monster was a jagged pill to swallow. But I swallowed it. I swallowed it and let it fuel the cold, mechanical part of my brain. "Uncle Vernon," I said smoothly, my voice lacking any trace of defensiveness, "I appreciate your concern for my father's health. Can you tell me when you last saw him in person to verify this cognitive decline?" There was a brief, irritated pause on the other end of the line. "I do not need to see him to know what is going on," he scoffed. "Jamal told me everything. Jamal is the man of the house now. He is the son. It is his responsibility to make the hard medical decisions when the patriarch falls ill. You have always been too stubborn for your own good, Aaliyah. You work too much, you have no husband, and you do not understand the logistics of elder care. Jamal and Chelsea have found a beautiful, secure facility. You need to bring Calvin back to their house immediately so Jamal can execute the medical conservatorship." I smiled at my monitor. He had just handed me a golden admission. He confirmed on tape that he had no first-hand knowledge of my father's condition, that he was acting purely on Jamal's instructions, and that the ultimate goal was a forced medical conservatorship. "So, just to be entirely clear," I replied, making sure the recording captured my precise phrasing, "you are fully supporting a legal motion to strip my father of his financial and medical autonomy and to lock him in a psychiatric facility based entirely on a phone call you received from Jamal this morning." "I am supporting my nephew and protecting my brother," Uncle Vernon snapped. "And if you do not bring him back, Jamal has my full blessing to tell the judge that you are obstructing his medical care. Do not make us choose sides, Aaliyah, because you will lose." "Thank you for your guidance, Uncle Vernon," I said politely. "I will give your advice exactly the consideration it deserves." I disconnected the call before he could utter another threat. I clicked save on the audio file, exporting it directly to the digital dossier labeled Family Affidavits. The satisfying chime of the file securing itself in the cloud echoed in my quiet office. My phone did not stay silent for long. 2 minutes later, Cousin Tasha called. Tasha was the family gossip, a woman who thrived on drama and lived her entire life vicariously through social media. I accepted the call and initiated a new recording. "Aaliyah, what is wrong with you?" Tasha shrieked, her voice pitched high with theatrical panic. "Have you seen Chelsea's video? She is literally crying on the internet. Her face is completely pale. She looks terrified. How could you just leave her and Jamal to deal with the police all by themselves?" I continued to monitor the audio levels on my screen, ensuring her voice was coming through crystal clear. "Have you spoken to my father today, Tasha?" I asked mildly. Have you asked him what happened? Why would I talk to him when he does not even know what year it is? Tasha shot back, completely buying into the gaslighting. Jamal sent a massive group text to the whole family this morning. He told us that Uncle Calvin's brain is just gone. He said we all need to sign letters of support for the conservatorship so the judge can fast-track the facility placement. Jamal said you are in deep denial and refusing to accept reality. I paused, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. Jamal sent a group text asking for written letters of support for a legal proceeding against my father. Yes, Tasha huffed. And I am writing mine right now. Chelsea is a wreck, Aaliyah. You know how hard she tries to fit into this family. She has been nothing but sweet to Uncle Calvin, and for him to just snap and attack her like a wild animal is horrifying. You need to stop being a bitter single career woman and help your brother put him in a home where he belongs. The sheer weight of the misogynoir and internalized racism was suffocating. My own cousin was weaponizing my single status and my career against me, while simultaneously defending the performative white tears of a woman who had just committed a felony against our blood relative. Chelsea had effectively colonized my family's empathy, and Jamal was her willing accomplice. Tasha, I said, my tone eerily calm, I strongly advise you against signing any legal documents or affidavits regarding my father's mental state. Signing a sworn statement about a medical condition you have not personally witnessed is perjury. I would hate for you to be implicated in a fraudulent legal filing. You are just jealous because Jamal is actually taking charge, Tasha sneered. We are all signing them, Aaliyah. You cannot stop the whole family. I ended the call. I saved the file. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath. The betrayal was complete. Jamal had successfully isolated me from the entire extended family. He had painted me as an unstable, denial-ridden spinster who was endangering an ailing man. He had gathered an army of flying monkeys to bombard me with guilt, shame, and threats of legal retaliation. They expected me to crack. They expected the social isolation to break my spirit. They thought that by weaponizing the family hierarchy and patriarchal expectations, I would surrender my father to the system just to avoid being ostracized. They fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I do not crave the approval of people who would blindly throw an innocent black man into the teeth of the justice system to appease a crying white woman. I do not negotiate with proxies. I destroy the source. Every single phone call I recorded was another brick in the fortress I was building. Winston, their aggressive lawyer, was going to walk into family court armed with dozens of character affidavits from aunts, uncles, and cousins, claiming my father was violently insane. He was going to use those letters to demand an emergency conservatorship, and I was going to let him submit them. I was going to let Winston officially enter those lies into the court record under penalty of perjury. Because the moment he did, I was going to drop sworn medical evaluations from the top neurologists in the state, proving my father was in perfect cognitive health. I was going to prove that Jamal had orchestrated a massive coordinated conspiracy to defraud the court. I was going to turn every single family member who signed an affidavit into a documented liar, and I was going to hand the judge the audio recordings proving they colluded to do it. The door to my office opened softly. I turned my chair away from the monitors. My father stood in the doorway. He was dressed in his favorite charcoal suit, the one he used to wear to graduation ceremonies when he was a principal. His tie was perfectly knotted. His shoes were polished. Despite the dark, painful bruises blooming across his forearms, he looked dignified, sharp, and entirely unbroken. He looked like the brilliant educator he had been for 40 years, not the violent, demented threat his son was portraying him to be. "Are you ready, baby girl?" he asked, his voice steady and rich. I stood up, grabbing my designer tote bag, containing his medical history files. I looked at the man who had taught me everything I knew about resilience and grace under fire. I felt a fierce, protective pride swell in my chest, completely washing away the toxic sting of the family's betrayal. "I am ready, Dad," I told him, walking toward the door. "Let us go build your armor." We stepped into the private elevator and descended to the secure underground parking garage. The ride down was silent, but the air in the small space felt highly charged with anticipation. I unlocked my black SUV, the heavy doors clicking open with a solid, reassuring thud. I helped my father into the passenger seat, making sure the seatbelt did not press too harshly against the dark, angry bruises spreading across his forearms. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and navigated out into the bustling morning traffic with the precision of a military convoy. I kept my eyes on the road and explained the strategy. I told my father that in corporate warfare, when a hostile entity questions your financial solvency, you do not just provide a bank statement and hope they believe you. You bring in 3 independent, merciless auditors to certify your ledgers and dare the opposition to question their findings. Today, his mind was the ledger, and we were going to the most unforgiving auditors in the state. We were not going to a family practitioner or a general clinic. I had leveraged my firm's premium health concierge service to secure emergency appointments with the absolute top-tier specialists in the region. Our first stop was the pristine glass and steel clinic of Dr. Eris Thorne, one of the most formidable and respected neurologists on the East Coast. Dr. Thorne frequently testified as an expert medical witness in high-stakes federal trials. If Jamal and Chelsea's aggressive lawyer wanted to cross-examine Dr. Thorne in a family court proceeding, the lawyer would be publicly humiliated and laughed out of the room. We walked into the high-end clinic. Dr. Thorne did not waste time with pleasantries. He took one look at the deep purple and black contusions on my father's arms and raised a highly skeptical eyebrow. I handed him the legal directive I had drafted in my office. I told him we needed a comprehensive cognitive evaluation, a brain scan, and a sworn affidavit regarding my father's mental acuity, and we needed the results expedited immediately. For the next 2 hours, I sat in the sterile, quiet waiting room. I monitored my encrypted phone, watching the digital dossier update in real time as my firm's lead forensic accountant began tearing through Chelsea's dark web footprint. But my primary focus remained entirely on the heavy oak doors leading to the examination rooms. Inside, my father was subjected to a battery of relentless cognitive and neurological stress tests. They ran the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Complex, spatial reasoning puzzles, delayed word recall exercises, and advanced executive function scenarios designed to detect even the slightest hint of cognitive decline. They placed him in an MRI machine to scan the physical structure of his brain, looking for plaque buildup, shrinkage, or any structural anomalies that could remotely suggest early-onset dementia. Finally, the oak doors swung open. Dr. Thorne emerged, holding a thick, securely bound medical file. He looked at me, completely baffled by the entire premise of our visit. He stated in a clear, authoritative tone that Calvin possessed the cognitive function and rapid processing speed of a man 20 years his junior. My father had breezed through the complex examinations without a single hesitation. The MRI scans showed absolute physical perfection. There was 0 brain shrinkage, 0 plaque, and 0 signs of early-onset dementia. The narrative Chelsea had sold to the police, the story Jamal had validated to the entire extended family, was not just a lie. It was a biologically impossible fiction. But we did not stop there. In the world of crisis management, 1 expert doctor is a medical opinion, but 3 expert doctors construct an impenetrable legal fortress. I thanked Dr. Thorne, secured his initial findings, and drove my father directly to the clinical psychology wing of the premier university research hospital in the city. I had booked back-to-back psychological evaluations with 2 highly distinguished psychiatrists who specialized in geriatric trauma, behavioral health, and elder abuse. Jamal and Chelsea had explicitly claimed in their legal petition that my father had suffered a violent, unpredictable psychotic break. They claimed he was paranoid, aggressively hostile, and entirely detached from reality. I needed these specific psychiatrists to officially dismantle that vicious lie and document his true state of mind. My father sat in those plush, leather psychiatric chairs and spoke with profound, heartbreaking clarity. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of the deranged aggression his son had formerly accused him of. He carried himself with the quiet, stoic dignity of a man who had spent 40 years running a high school and guiding thousands of students toward better futures. He calmly explained the financial embezzlement he had uncovered. He described the sudden physical assault he endured from his privileged white daughter-in-law when he confronted her with the evidence. He articulated the profound, suffocating grief of watching his own child, the son he had sacrificed his retirement to educate, corroborate a false police report simply to protect a fraudulent marriage. The psychiatrists conducted their rigorous behavioral assessments looking for any underlying pathology, paranoia, or emotional instability. They found absolutely nothing but the appropriate measured grief of a deeply betrayed parent. One of the psychiatrists, a stern woman who had seen decades of severe elder abuse cases, actually had tears welling in her eyes by the time the evaluation concluded. She noted in her official clinical assessment that Calvin was experiencing entirely normal emotional distress given the extreme trauma of familial betrayal and physical assault. However, she explicitly documented that he exhibited zero signs of psychosis, paranoia, or dementia. He was not a threat to himself. He was not a threat to others. He was simply the victim of a vicious, highly coordinated attack. I had Elias send his top legal notary directly to the hospital lobby. We sat at a polished mahogany table in the medical center's executive lounge, surrounded by quiet professionals. I watched with immense satisfaction as the neurologist and both psychiatrists reviewed their comprehensive reports and signed their respective medical affidavits. The notary verified their identities and stamped the heavy watermarked paper, the loud clack of the official seal locking the absolute truth permanently into the legal record. I picked up the 3 folders and slid them into my designer tote bag. They were heavy, crisp, and immaculate. This was the armor I had promised my father. Jamal and Chelsea honestly thought they could use the legal system to cage an innocent black man. They thought they could weaponize medical terminology to steal his estate and cover up their financial crimes. They assumed that because my father was older, he would be easily confused and easily dismissed by a biased system. They made a fatal, unrecoverable miscalculation. They assumed I would play defense. They assumed I would show up to family court crying overwhelmed and begging a judge to believe my father was sane, while fighting an uphill battle against their perfectly curated white tears and fake concern. Instead, I was going to walk into that courtroom holding sworn notarized testimony from the most unassailable medical minds in the country. If their aggressive hack lawyer dared to submit Jamal's fabricated affidavit claiming my father was violently demented, I would drop these ironclad documents directly onto the judge's desk. I would immediately request a referral to the district attorney for perjury, filing a false police report and attempting to defraud the court. I looked over at my father as we walked out of the hospital's sliding glass doors and into the bright afternoon sunlight. He stood taller now, the heavy burden of their gaslighting completely lifted from his shoulders by the validation of the medical experts. The psychological warfare Jamal had tried to wage was entirely neutralized. My father knew he was sharp, he knew he was right, and he knew he was completely safe under my protection. I unlocked the SUV and helped him inside. The medical shield was successfully built and completely bulletproof. Now it was time to transition from defense to pure, unadulterated offense. I needed to know exactly how deep Chelsea's financial rot went, and I needed the exact dollar amounts that would put her behind bars. I put the car in gear and headed back to the penthouse, ready to unleash my forensic accountants and follow the stolen money straight to their ruin. I parked the SUV in my designated spot in the underground garage. My father walked to the elevator with a noticeably lighter step, the validation of the medical specialists having restored the dignity Jamal and Chelsea had tried to strip away. I escorted him back into the penthouse, ordered him a high-protein lunch from his favorite restaurant, and insisted he take a nap. He had fought his battle for the day. The rest of the war belonged to me. I locked myself in my home office and woke up my multi-monitor workstation. The encrypted communication channel I use for highly sensitive corporate espionage was already blinking with a priority notification. It was from Julian, the most ruthless and meticulous forensic accountant on my firm's payroll. Julian is the man I call when a Fortune 500 CEO needs to quietly locate offshore funds before a federal audit. He does not just read bank statements. He dissects the digital anatomy of a financial crime. I initiated the secure video link. Julian's face appeared on my center monitor, framed by the dark walls of his own secure server room. He did not bother with a greeting. He simply shared his screen, flooding my secondary monitors with a sprawling color-coded digital flowchart of wire transfers, shell companies, and encrypted ledgers. "We have a massive problem," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of judgment, but heavy with professional urgency. "Or rather, your sister-in-law has a massive problem, and she dragged your father's equity right into the blast radius." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, my eyes tracking the red lines connecting Calvin's home address to a web of offshore holding companies. "Walk me through the timeline, Julian. I want every single dollar accounted for." Julian zoomed in on a specific cluster of transactions dated exactly 4 months ago. He explained that Chelsea had bypassed standard banking security protocols by establishing a fake limited liability company. She used this shell company to mask her identity, then digitally forged my father's signature to authorize the $150,000 line of credit against his paid-off property. The bank approved it, assuming it was a legitimate home improvement loan authorized by the homeowner. But that was just the surface layer. The real sickness was buried much deeper. "I assumed she was using the stolen equity to fund her performative lifestyle," I told Julian. "I expected to see wire transfers to luxury car dealerships, high-end interior decorators, or designer boutiques." Julian shook his head. "That is what amateur fraudsters do. Chelsea is not an amateur. She is a desperate addict." I dug past the domestic banking layer and tracked the routing numbers on the outgoing wire transfers. "She did not buy handbags, Aaliyah. She bought gambling chips." Julian pulled up a secondary spreadsheet, and my stomach plummeted as I read the headers. Chelsea was entirely consumed by a massive secret online gambling addiction. She had been bleeding money into offshore unregulated sportsbooks and illicit high-stakes digital poker rooms. The $150,000 she stole from my father was not a down payment on a new life. It was a desperate attempt to cover up a catastrophic string of losses. Julian highlighted a series of aggressive incoming email transcripts and encrypted text messages he had extracted from the dark web servers associated with her betting accounts. She owed 6 figures to underground creditors. These were not collection agencies who send polite letters in the mail and report you to a credit bureau. These were unregulated shadow entities who charge predatory interest rates and employ highly persuasive physical methods of debt collection. "She is drowning," Julian stated flatly. "The $150,000 from your father's house barely covered the interest on her outstanding underground loans. She needs more liquid cash, and she needs it immediately, or these creditors are going to start showing up at her country club brunches." The entire picture snapped into brutal high-definition focus. The fake police report, the weaponized white tears, the desperate rushed petition for a medical conservatorship. It was never about dementia. It was never about getting Calvin psychiatric help. Chelsea needed Jamal to be granted complete legal control over my father's estate. The second a judge signed that conservatorship order, Jamal would have the power to liquidate Calvin's remaining assets. Chelsea would then quietly siphon that money to pay off her shadow creditors before they broke her kneecaps or exposed her secret life to her affluent social circle. My father was just collateral damage in her desperate bid to stay alive. "But what about my brother?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Jamal is a vice president at a logistics firm. He makes a substantial salary. How could his wife steal 6 figures and wire it to offshore gambling syndicates without him noticing the massive holes in their joint accounts?" Julian let out a harsh, dry laugh. He pulled up a third dashboard, this one displaying domestic credit reports and mortgage statements. Jamal did not notice the missing money because Jamal is entirely financially illiterate. He is completely bankrupt, Aaliyah. He is just too busy playing the role of the rich, successful husband to realize the ship has already sunk. I stared at the financial breakdown of the golden child's life. It was a masterpiece of financial ruin disguised as generational wealth. Jamal had maxed out 5 different secret high-yield credit cards just to maintain the illusion of their lifestyle. The luxury cars they drove were leased at predatory rates. The country club membership was in arrears. Their mortgage was 2 months behind. Jamal was literally borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, shifting debt across various hidden accounts to keep the lights on and the champagne flowing. He was so terrified of looking like a failure to his white wife, so desperate to prove he belonged in her privileged world, that he had financed a life of complete fiction. He had absolutely no idea about Chelsea's gambling addiction or the stolen home equity because he was too busy hiding his own catastrophic financial failures from her. They were two broke, desperate frauds living in the same house, actively lying to each other while drowning in a sea of debt. And Jamal was willing to throw his own father into a psychiatric facility just to keep that beautiful hollow lie afloat. I felt a cold, absolute certainty settle over my entire body. My brother was not a victim of his wife's manipulation. He was a willing participant in a culture of deceit. He chose the aesthetic of success over the reality of his father's safety. Send me the complete certified forensic report, Julian. I want every ledger, every IP address, and every encrypted text message printed and bound in formal corporate dossiers. I am going to drop this financial bomb right in the middle of their perfect, curated lives. Julian nodded, his fingers already flying across his keyboard. You will have the encrypted files in your inbox in 10 minutes. The hard copies will be delivered via secure courier by tomorrow morning. Happy hunting. The video feed disconnected, leaving me alone with the staggering weight of the truth. The medical shield was in place. The financial motive was completely exposed and documented by a certified forensic accountant. Winston and associates were about to walk into family court arguing that my father was a violent threat, and I was going to hand the judge undeniable proof that my sister-in-law was a cornered criminal committing wire fraud to pay off illegal gambling debts. But I knew from years of dismantling corporate cover-ups that financial records and medical evaluations, while legally binding, lack the visceral emotional gut punch required to completely destroy a public narrative. Jamal and Chelsea had weaponized a video of her crying to manipulate our entire extended family. They had used visual storytelling to paint her as the victim and my father as the aggressor. I needed my own visual storytelling. I needed the undisputed physical evidence of the assault. I needed the smoking gun that connected the financial desperation directly to the physical violence inflicted on my father's arms. I opened a secure floor plan of my father's house on my monitor. Several months ago, when Calvin first suspected that small amounts of cash and valuable items were mysteriously disappearing from his home after Chelsea's visits, he had asked me for advice. I had purchased and installed a high-definition motion-activated nanny camera disguised as a standard smoke detector in his main hallway. It was positioned directly above the console table, the exact location where my father said Chelsea had grabbed the baseball bat. I checked the cloud storage associated with the camera, but the feed was dead. Chelsea or Jamal had likely disconnected the Wi-Fi router when they realized the severity of the situation, cutting off the remote upload. But the camera itself contained an internal encrypted SD card that recorded and stored footage locally as a failsafe. The footage of the assault was sitting inside that plastic smoke detector, locked inside a house that my brother and his criminal wife currently controlled. I knew they had already changed the locks. I knew they were guarding that property like a fortress. I closed the floor plan and pulled up my digital Rolodex. I did not need a key to get into that house. I had something far more powerful. I had the legal authority of a medical and financial power of attorney, and I had the absolute determination of a daughter who was about to burn their entire world to the ground. I picked up my phone to call a locksmith and a police escort. It was time to retrieve the final nail in their coffin. I pulled the heavy notarized power of attorney documents from my filing cabinet. My father had signed these years ago, long before Jamal and Chelsea started treating his estate like their personal piggy bank. A medical and financial power of attorney grants sweeping authority. In the eyes of the law, when it comes to my father's property and well-being, I speak with his voice. I picked up my phone and called a locksmith I frequently used for securing corporate assets. Next, I called the local precinct dispatch. I requested a civil standby, a routine procedure where a police officer escorts an individual to a hostile location to retrieve essential medical property. I stated clearly that my elderly father required his prescription heart medication and that his locks had been illegally changed by a third party. The dispatcher confirmed an officer would meet me at the property line in 30 minutes. I pulled up to the curb of my father's house. The property looked immaculate, the lawn freshly manicured, an aesthetic lie, masking the rot inside. Jamal's luxury-leased SUV was parked in the driveway. The patrol car pulled up right behind me. Officer Miller, a seasoned cop who looked completely unbothered by neighborhood drama, stepped out. I handed him the legal documents and explained the situation with clinical precision. We walked up the paved driveway together. The locksmith waited by his van with his heavy tools ready. Officer Miller knocked heavily on the front door. It swung open to reveal Jamal wearing an expensive golf polo, holding a cup of coffee. His arrogant smile vanished the instant he saw the badge, and then his eyes landed on me. The color drained from his face. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Chelsea appeared behind him, her eyes wide and frantic. "You cannot be here," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is our property now. We changed the locks for a reason. You are trespassing." I did not even look at her. I addressed Officer Miller directly. "As you can see by the notarized documents in your hand, I am the legal proxy for the homeowner. He requires his prescription medication. These individuals are unauthorized occupants who have illegally altered the locks on a property they do not own." Officer Miller turned to Jamal. "Sir, this document gives her full legal access. You need to step aside and let her retrieve the medical supplies." Jamal puffed out his chest, trying to muster some counterfeit authority. "We are in the process of filing a conservatorship," he stammered. "We have legal rights." "You have a pending petition," I corrected him smoothly. "A piece of paper waiting on a judge's desk." "I have an active, legally binding power of attorney. Now either you hand me the new keys, or my locksmith drills out the deadbolt and bills you for the property damage." Chelsea completely lost her mind. She pushed past Jamal and stormed out onto the front porch, her voice hitting a hysterical pitch. She screamed that I was harassing them. She threatened to call her lawyer and sue me for emotional distress. She yelled that I was endangering a fragile woman. I signaled the locksmith. He marched up the steps with his heavy industrial drill. Jamal panicked and threw his hands up in defeat. He pulled a shiny new key from his pocket and unlocked the door, stepping back into the foyer. Chelsea followed him, sobbing loudly, pulling out her phone to record me. I walked over the threshold, my designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors of my childhood home. The air inside smelled like expensive vanilla candles, Chelsea's desperate attempt to erase my father's presence. Officer Miller followed me inside, standing by the entrance with his arms crossed, watching them closely to ensure they maintained their distance. I walked straight past Chelsea, ignoring the camera she shoved in my face. I headed directly for the master bathroom. I needed to maintain the ironclad legal pretext of the visit. I grabbed a tote bag from the closet and began systematically loading my father's pill bottles, his blood pressure monitor, and a few comfortable sweaters. Every move I made was deliberate, calm, and completely legally unassailable. With the medical supplies secured, I slung the bag over my shoulder and walked back out into the main hallway. The console table where the assault took place was completely cleared off. The decorative baseball bat was suspiciously missing. Chelsea and Jamal were standing near the front door, looking deeply uncomfortable under the silent, watchful gaze of the police officer. I stopped directly under the hallway smoke detector. It was a standard circular white plastic device mounted flawlessly against the ceiling drywall. My father had installed it himself 6 months ago. It did not just detect smoke, it recorded high-definition video and audio to an internal memory card. Chelsea glared at me. "You got what you came for?" She spat, her phone still recording my every move. "Now get out of my house." I reached up. I am tall, and in 3-inch heels I easily gripped the plastic casing of the smoke detector. I gave it a sharp, deliberate twist counterclockwise. The device clicked and detached from the ceiling mount, resting heavily in the palm of my hand. Jamal frowned, stepping forward. "What are you doing?" "Put that back. That is safety equipment." I did not answer. I turned the device over and popped open the small battery compartment. Right beside the AA batteries was a tiny black micro SD card. I pressed it with my thumbnail. It clicked and sprang loose. I pulled the memory card out and slipped it directly into the inner zippered pocket of my designer purse. Chelsea's phone camera dropped. Her fake outrage evaporated instantly, replaced by a stark, paralyzing terror. She recognized the device. She knew exactly where it had been pointing last night. She looked at the empty spot on the ceiling, then down at the console table, and finally at me. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. The realization hit her like a physical blow. I had just confiscated the digital witness to her felony assault. I popped the empty plastic shell of the smoke detector back onto the ceiling mount and gave it a twist to lock it in place. I smoothed the front of my jacket and walked toward the front door. Officer Miller opened the door for me. I stepped out onto the porch, the bright midday sun blinding after the dim hallway. Jamal and Chelsea followed me out onto the driveway like tethered ghosts. They were completely silent. The hysterical screaming and the legal threats had completely vanished. I walked to my SUV and opened the driver's side door. I tossed the tote bag onto the passenger seat. Before I climbed in, I turned back to face them. Chelsea was standing on the manicured lawn, trembling, her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist. I looked her dead in the eyes. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile, and tapped the side of my purse exactly where the SD card was resting. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own hubris. The evidence was secured. The trap was fully armed. It was time to invite them to dinner. I returned to my penthouse and immediately uploaded the contents of the confiscated SD card to my encrypted server. I watched the video once just to verify the file integrity. The high-definition footage captured every brutal second of Chelsea grabbing that decorative bat and striking my father, followed by her calculated theatrical phone call to emergency services. It was sickening to watch my father endure that violence, but it was exactly the smoking gun I needed. I locked the video file deep in my digital vault. 30 minutes later, an email hit my inbox. The sender was Jamal. I opened the message and analyzed the tone. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression masquerading as a sibling olive branch. He wrote that the last 48 hours had been incredibly stressful for everyone involved. He claimed that he and Chelsea wanted to avoid a messy public court battle that would only embarrass our family and further distress our father. He proposed a peaceful family dinner at the Sterling, one of the most exclusive, heavily booked steakhouses in the city. He explicitly stated that we needed to sit down and work things out of court like adults. In my profession, an invitation to a neutral location to discuss a settlement before a lawsuit is formally filed is never a genuine olive branch. It is an ambush. Jamal was not looking for a compromise. He was looking for a controlled environment where he could leverage social pressure to force a surrender. I knew exactly what he was planning, and I also knew that turning down the invitation would give his legal counsel ammunition to tell a family court judge that I was uncooperative and obstructing familial resolution. I typed a single line in response, accepting the invitation for 8 o'clock the following evening. I walked into the guest suite to brief my father on the upcoming engagement. I did not sugarcoat the reality of what we were walking into. I told him Jamal was going to use the extended family to guilt-trip us into submission. I warned him that Chelsea would likely perform her fragile victim routine for the captive audience. My father listened quietly while adjusting the cuffs of his pristine dress shirt. He looked at me with a steady, unbreakable gaze and told me he was not afraid of a room full of people who had already shown their true colors. He had faced down unruly school board meetings for decades. A table full of hypocrites was not going to break him. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in logistical warfare. I finalized the physical dossiers. I had my assistant print everything on heavy premium legal paper and bind them in sleek, unmarked black folders. Each corporate-bound folder contained Julian forensic accounting report, detailing the offshore gambling debts, the notarized medical affidavits from the neurologists and psychiatrists, and the full transcripts of the hostile phone calls from Aunt Valerie and Cousin Tasha. I packed the heavy folders into my designer tote bag along with my high-resolution tablet. When we arrived at the Sterling the following night, the air was thick with the scent of expensive steaks and aged bourbon. The maitre d' escorted us past the crowded main dining floor, leading us down a dimly lit mahogany-paneled hallway reserved for high-profile clients. He stopped in front of heavy double oak doors, pushing them open to reveal the private dining room. I stepped over the threshold with my father right beside me and took in the scene. The room was dripping with opulence, featuring a massive oak table set beneath a cascading crystal chandelier. But the guest list was the real spectacle. Jamal and Chelsea sat at the head of the table like unearned royalty. Chelsea was wearing a modest high-necked dress, looking intentionally pale and fragile. Surrounding them were the flying monkeys I had spoken to on the phone. Uncle Vernon sat with his arms tightly crossed, his face set in a deep, judgmental scowl. Cousin Tasha was whispering to another aunt, her eyes darting toward us the moment we walked in, her face twisted in a mask of manufactured concern. And sitting directly to Jamal left was a man in a sharp $1,000 pinstripe suit, with a thick leather briefcase resting at his feet. I recognized him instantly from industry magazines and legal journals. It was Winston, the aggressive family law attorney they had hired to file the conservatorship. They had brought a legal shark to a family dinner. The setup was flawlessly transparent. Jamal had gathered the most vocal, influential members of our extended family to serve as a Greek chorus of disapproval. He brought Winston to provide the heavy-handed legal intimidation. They expected me to walk into this room, see the sheer numbers aligned against me, and fold under the weight of their collective judgment. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They genuinely believed a single woman facing the patriarchal pressure of her uncle, the social pressure of her gossiping cousins, and the legal threats of an arrogant lawyer would quietly sign over her father's rights just to escape the public humiliation. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair for my father and took the seat directly next to him. I placed my heavy tote bag on the floor right beside my heels, ensuring it was within easy reach. I looked around the room, making deliberate, unblinking eye contact with every single person sitting at that table. I did not smile. I did not frown. I offered them the exact same blank, impenetrable expression I use when facing down hostile corporate boards. The air in the room grew thick with tension, a suffocating silence settling over the crystal water glasses and expensive silverware. Jamal cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to project the image of a reasonable, concerned patriarch taking charge of a difficult situation. He thanked us for coming, claiming this private room was a safe space for us to discuss the unfortunate reality of our father's declining health without the interference of the courts. He actually used the word safe space while his hired legal counsel sat 3 feet away, preparing to strip my father of his basic human rights. I did not say a word. I simply folded my hands on the pristine white tablecloth and waited. In a high-stakes hostage negotiation, you never speak first. You let the captors lay out all their demands, allowing them to bask in their false sense of absolute control. You let them reveal the full scope of their arrogance. I was going to let them set the stage, say their rehearsed lines, and dig the trench as deep as they possibly could before I buried them in it. Jamal gestured to his wife, passing the invisible microphone. Chelsea took her cue with the precision of a seasoned stage actress. She lowered her head, allowing her blonde hair to fall forward, shielding her face just enough to make her look small and defenseless. When she finally looked up, her eyes were swimming with perfectly manufactured tears. She reached across the table, her hands visibly trembling, and began her monologue. She told the room how much she adored my father. She talked about how he had welcomed her into this family with open arms, and how it broke her heart to see his brilliant mind succumb to such a dark, unforgiving disease. She let out a breathy, dramatic sob, clutching a linen napkin to her chest. Then she pivoted to the night of the incident. She did not look at my father while she spoke. She looked exclusively at Uncle Vernon and the aunts, ensuring she had captured their total empathy. She described the sheer terror of being trapped in her own hallway, facing a man she loved who suddenly did not recognize her. She painted a picture of herself as a helpless victim of a senseless psychiatric tragedy, claiming she only called the police because she was absolutely terrified he was going to unintentionally kill her. "I need you to know I hold no anger toward him," Chelsea whispered, letting one single tear track down her cheek. "He is sick. He needs intensive psychiatric help, and Jamal and I are just trying to get him the absolute best care possible before he hurts himself or someone else." The performance was flawless. Cousin Tasha audibly sniffled, reaching over to pat Chelsea's arm in solidarity. Uncle Vernon nodded solemnly, his face etched with righteous sorrow. They were completely spellbound by the fragility on display. With the audience perfectly primed, Jamal took over to close the trap. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany table, and turned his gaze entirely on me. This was the moment he planned to publicly strip me of my authority. "Aliyah, I know you love Dad," Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension, "but we have to look at the reality of this situation. You are a single woman. You work 80 hours a week chasing corporate contracts. You have no husband to help you, and you have absolutely no maternal instinct. Caring for a large man with violent dementia is not a job for a career-obsessed spinster who lives in a glass tower." He let the insult hang in the air, ensuring every family member absorbed the blatant misogynoir. He was weaponizing my independence, my success, and my black womanhood against me. In Jamal's twisted mind, because I did not cater to the patriarchal ideal of submission and domesticity, I was inherently unqualified to protect my own flesh and blood. He was elevating Chelsea's fake fragility over my proven competence. "You do not have the time, the patience, or the temperament to deal with this," Jamal continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "Chelsea's family has deep connections in the medical community. They have pulled some major strings and found an opening at a beautiful, highly secure memory care facility located in the suburbs. It is a locked ward, which is exactly what Dad needs right now for his own physical safety. They have around-the-clock psychiatric staff who are trained to handle violent outbursts." My father sat beside me, his back perfectly straight, his expression an unreadable mask of quiet dignity. He did not react to his own son discussing him as if he were a rabid animal that needed to be caged. He trusted me implicitly, and he played his part by remaining absolutely silent. Winston, the aggressive family law attorney, chose this exact moment to justify his exorbitant retainer fee. He reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents. He slid them across the polished wood table until they rested directly in front of me. "Ms. Barnes," Winston said, utilizing his most authoritative courtroom voice, "what your brother is offering here is a graceful exit from a highly volatile situation. We have the emergency conservatorship petition fully drafted and ready to file at the courthouse tomorrow morning. If we proceed to a public hearing, the details of your father's violent episode will become a matter of public record. Given your firm's high-profile public relations clientele, I imagine you do not want your family's messy psychiatric emergencies splashed across the local news." Winston tapped his expensive gold pen against the top of the document. "However, if you simply sign this consent waiver, relinquishing your claim to power of attorney, my clients will assume full legal and financial guardianship over Calvin. They will handle the facility placement, privately manage his estate to cover the exorbitant medical costs, and spare you the public humiliation of a trial. You can go back to your penthouses and your corporate clients, and leave the heavy lifting to the people who are actually equipped to handle it." I looked at the documents resting on the tablecloth. I looked at Winston's smug, punchable face. I looked at Chelsea, who was currently hiding a satisfied smirk behind her linen napkin. And finally, I looked at my brother. Jamal sat back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked like a man who believed he had just executed a flawless checkmate. He thought he had completely boxed me in. He genuinely believed that the threat of public embarrassment, combined with the collective judgment of our extended family, would force me to quietly surrender my father's life and life savings to his control. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to impress his wife that he failed to notice the foundational flaw in his entire strategy. I let the silence stretch. I let it grow heavy and uncomfortable. In a crisis negotiation, silence forces the opposition to question their own leverage. I watched Uncle Vernon shift uneasily in his seat. I watched Cousin Tasha glance nervously at the heavy double doors of the private dining room. Jamal leaned forward again, clearly agitated by my lack of reaction. "Are you going to sign the waiver, Aliyah? Or are we doing this the hard way tomorrow in front of a judge?" I placed my hands flat on the table, my manicured nails resting against the cool white linen. I made sure my voice carried clearly to every single corner of that room, ensuring there was absolutely no ambiguity about what was happening. So I replied my tone perfectly, even maintaining absolute professional restraint. Just so I have this completely clear for the record. You are telling me that if I sign away my father's legal rights and hand you total control of his financial estate, you will handle his placement in a psychiatric facility privately. But if I refuse to surrender his money and his autonomy to you tonight, you and your attorney intend to drag his name through family court tomorrow and publicly destroy his reputation using the police report from last night. Is that the ultimatum currently on this table? Jamal scowled, clearly irritated that I was stripping away the polite veneer of their extortion attempt. Do not twist my words into a threat, he snapped. We are giving you a choice to do the right thing for Dad before things get ugly. Winston nodded sharply in agreement. It is not an ultimatum, Ms. Barnes. It is a highly practical legal compromise. I strongly advise you to sign the waiver. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the precise lethal expression I wear right before I authorize a press release that bankrupts a hostile entity. I see, I said quietly. I reached down to the floor beside my heels and wrapped my fingers around the thick leather handles of my designer tote bag. I hoisted the heavy bag onto my lap. I did not break eye contact with my brother as I unzipped the main compartment. They had spent the last 20 minutes digging the trench. Now it was time to drop the bodies into it. Jamal leaned back, crossing his arms with a smug, self-satisfied expression, fully believing his trap had sprung perfectly. He exchanged a knowing look with Chelsea, who offered a small, tragic sigh for the benefit of the watching relatives. The air in the private dining room was thick with their arrogance. I kept my face entirely blank, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Winston shift his weight in his expensive Italian loafers. I reached for my water glass, taking a slow sip. My father sat beside me, a pillar of quiet dignity, his hands resting on the table. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply watched his son dismantle his own future. I placed the glass down, ensuring the clink echoed against the mahogany. So, I began pitching my voice to be heard clearly by everyone, including Cousin Tasha, who was leaning forward, desperate for the gossip. If I understand this correctly, you are offering a trade. Winston straightened his tie. It's not a trade, Ms. Barnes. It's a practical resolution to a deeply unfortunate medical crisis. We are offering discretion in exchange for your cooperation. I nodded slowly, adopting the posture of an overwhelmed, exhausted daughter grappling with a massive decision. I let my shoulders slump slightly. I looked down at the table, then up at Jamal. You want me to sign the waiver. You want full power of attorney. Jamal nodded, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. It's for the best, Aaliyah. You know you don't have the bandwidth for this. We're equipped. We have the facility lined up. Dad needs professional locked-door care. You can't provide that. And if I sign it, I pressed, keeping my tone submissive. If I hand over total legal and financial control of Dad's estate tonight. The police report regarding his violent episode stays buried. The conservatorship hearing tomorrow is canceled. Winston leaned forward, eager to close the deal. Precisely. If your brother assumes guardianship tonight via this waiver, the need for an emergency court order is negated. The police report remains a sealed domestic matter. We handle the placement privately, and Calvin's dignity and your firm's reputation remains intact. Chelsea dabbed at her eyes again. We just want what's best for him, Aaliyah. It broke my heart to see him like that. We just want him safe. I turned my attention to Uncle Vernon, who was nodding sagely at Chelsea's performance. And the family supports this. You all agree that surrendering his estate to Jamal is the only way to keep Dad out of a psychiatric ward. Uncle Vernon huffed, irritated that I was even questioning it. It's the only sensible option. Jamal is stepping up. He's taking the burden off you. You should be thanking him, not interrogating him. I looked back at Jamal, ensuring my eyes met his directly. And the finances. The estate? You'll manage all of it. I'll handle everything, Jamal assured me smoothly. The facility costs his remaining debts the mortgage. You won't have to worry about a single dime. Chelsea and I will take full responsibility for the financial transition. I let out a shaky breath, playing the role to the hilt. I needed them to confirm the extortion unequivocally in front of 20 witnesses. I just want to be absolutely clear, I said, my voice trembling slightly. You are saying that if I give you total control of Dad's money, you won't force him into court. You are exchanging his freedom from a public psychiatric hearing for control of his assets. Winston frowned slightly, recognizing the bluntness of the phrasing, but Jamal arrogant, financially illiterate, Jamal plowed right through the lawyer's caution. Yes, Aaliyah, Jamal said, loudly exasperated. That is exactly what we are saying. Sign the paper, hand over the estate, and we keep this quiet. Don't sign it, and we go to court tomorrow, expose his violent breakdown, and force the issue. It's your choice. The trap snapped shut with an almost audible click. I sat up straight. The slump in my shoulders vanished. The manufactured tremor in my voice disappeared. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the submissive daughter dissolved, replaced instantly by the senior corporate crisis consultant. I looked at Winston. The aggressive lawyer suddenly looked very uncomfortable. He realized a fraction of a second too late what his client had just done. Thank you, Jamal, I said, my voice ringing out crisp and lethal. I needed you to explicitly confirm that extortion attempt on the record. Jamal frowned, confusion replacing his smugness. Extortion, I'm offering a settlement. You are threatening to weaponize a false police report and a fabricated medical crisis in family court unless I sign over financial assets. I corrected him, my tone conversational, but slicing through the room like a scalpel. That is the textbook definition of extortion, and you just confessed to it in front of a dozen witnesses and your own legal counsel. Chelsea dropped her napkin, the tears instantly drying up. What are you talking about? We're trying to help him. I didn't look at her. I reached down to the floor and grasped the heavy leather handles of my designer tote bag. I hoisted it onto the table. It landed with a solid, authoritative thud that made Cousin Tasha jump. Winston shifted his chair back slightly. He recognized the shift in energy. He recognized the tote bag. In legal circles, when the opposing party brings a bag that heavy to a settlement dinner, it means they aren't there to negotiate. They are there to execute. You brought documents? Winston asked, his voice tight. I brought reality, Winston, I replied. You walked in here intending to force a surrender based on a fabricated narrative. You assumed I was playing defense. You assumed wrong. I unzipped the main compartment of the tote bag. I pulled out the first of the pristine corporate-bound black folders. The thick premium paper rustled loudly in the sudden dead silence of the private dining room. I did not rush. I let the anticipation build, letting the dread slowly seep into Jamal and Chelsea's expressions as they realized I had not come to this dinner unarmed. I slid the first folder across the mahogany table. It stopped precisely in front of Winston. I pulled out a second folder and slid it to Jamal. The third went to Uncle Vernon. Go ahead, I instructed them, my voice echoing in the quiet room. Open them. I believe you'll find the contents highly relevant to your conservatorship petition. Winston opened his folder first. His eyes immediately locked onto the first page. I watched the blood drain from his face in real time. He was a ruthless lawyer, but he wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Jamal opened his folder, confusion clouding his features as he stared at the dense financial spreadsheets. Chelsea leaned over to look at Jamal's copy. The moment her eyes registered the headers on the documents, she let out a sharp, choked gasp, recoiling as if the paper had physically burned her. What is this? Uncle Vernon demanded, squinting at the pages in his folder. These are bank statements. What does this have to do with Calvin's mind? Everything, Uncle Vernon, I said smoothly. Because there is nothing wrong with my father's mind, but there is something catastrophically wrong with your nephew's bank accounts. Jamal looked up at me, his arrogance entirely shattered, replaced by a hollow, sinking dread. Aaliyah, what did you do? I didn't do anything, Jamal, I replied, standing up slowly, towering over the table. I just followed the money. I remained standing at the head of the table. The shift in the room was absolute. The arrogant predators who had walked into this restaurant expecting an easy surrender were suddenly staring down the barrel of a certified forensic audit. I placed my hands flat on the table and directed their attention to the first tab in the black folders. Turn to page 1. I instructed, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. That is a certified, legally binding report from my crisis firm's lead forensic accountant. It details the complete financial anatomy of Jamal and Chelsea's marriage over the last 5 years. Jamal stared at the pages, his mouth opening and closing. He looked like a man trying to read a foreign language. "These are fabricated," he stammered, his voice lacking any real conviction. "You generated fake bank statements to make us look bad." "I did not generate anything," I replied smoothly. "Those are the exact routing numbers, account balances, and transaction histories for the 5 secret high-yield credit cards you maxed out to pay for your leased luxury cars and your country club membership. You are completely bankrupt, Jamal. You have been shuffling debt across hidden accounts for 2 years just to maintain the illusion of generational wealth to impress your wife's friends. You do not even own the suit you are wearing tonight." Cousin Tasha let out a loud, audible gasp. She flipped frantically through the pages, her eyes widening as she read the catastrophic negative balances. Uncle Vernon dropped his reading glasses onto the table, rubbing his forehead, as the reality of his golden nephew's financial ruin sank in. "But Jamal's bankruptcy is merely the appetizer," I continued, not allowing them a single second to recover. "The real disease is detailed on page 4. I suggest you all turn to it. Winston, pay very close attention to this section. Your legal license depends on it." Winston flipped the heavy pages instantly. The smug family law attorney was suddenly sweating. He was reading the forensic trace of the $150,000 line of credit. 4 months ago, I explained to the captivated room Chelsea bypassed standard banking security protocols by establishing a fake limited liability company. She used this shell company to digitally forge my father's signature. She illegally authorized a $150,000 line of credit against his paid-off property. She funneled that cash directly into her own accounts. Jamal turned slowly to look at his wife. The denial in his eyes was warring with the terrifying realization that I was telling the exact truth. "Chelsea," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What is she talking about? Tell them this is a lie." Chelsea shrank back into her chair. Her face was entirely bloodless. The performative tears she had used to manipulate the family just minutes ago were gone, replaced by the stark, paralyzed panic of a cornered criminal. She could not speak. She could not formulate a lie fast enough to counter the certified bank records sitting right in front of her husband. "She cannot tell you. It is a lie, Jamal, because the money is already gone," I said, driving the final nail into the coffin. "Turn to page 7. That is where the money went." The sound of thick paper turning echoed around the private dining room. Every single family member, the same flying monkeys who had called me to demand I lock my father away, were now staring at the undeniable proof of Chelsea's dark web footprint. "Chelsea is not just a thief," I announced, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the room. "She is a desperate addict. She has a massive secret online gambling addiction. She bled that stolen $150,000 into offshore unregulated sportsbooks and illicit high-stakes digital poker rooms. And she did not just lose my father's money. She owes an additional 6 figures to underground creditors." I watched Uncle Vernon's jaw drop. Tasha covered her mouth with her hands. The entire extended family was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the scandal. "These are not credit card companies who send polite collection letters," I continued, leaning forward slightly to emphasize the danger. "These are shadow entities who use highly physical methods of debt collection. She is drowning. The stolen equity barely covered the interest on her outstanding underground loans. She needs more liquid cash, and she needs it immediately, or these creditors are going to start showing up at her suburban doorstep." I turned my gaze directly to Winston. The lawyer looked like he was going to be physically sick. I connected the dots for him loud and clear. "This was never about early-onset dementia, Winston. This was never about getting Calvin's psychiatric help. This was a hostile asset takeover designed specifically to bury a felony. Chelsea needed Jamal to be granted complete legal control over my father's estate. The second a judge signed that conservatorship order, Jamal would have the power to liquidate my father's remaining assets. Chelsea would then quietly siphon that money to pay off her shadow creditors before they broke her legs or exposed her secret life. My father was just collateral damage in her desperate bid to stay alive, I said, pointing a finger at my trembling sister-in-law. She hit him with a baseball bat because he found the bank statements. She called the police and faked a domestic disturbance because she needed to discredit him. And she pushed for a conservatorship so she could legally launder stolen money by hiding it beneath layers of fabricated elder care expenses. And you, Winston, were the getaway driver she hired to facilitate the fraud in family court. Winston slammed his folder shut. He shoved his chair back from the table so violently it nearly tipped over. In the legal profession, knowingly filing a petition based on a financial crime is a fast track to disbarment and federal indictment. He knew I had just saved him from stepping on a landmine, but he also knew his clients had lied to him in spectacular fashion. Jamal was shaking his head back and forth, staring at the forensic ledgers. He looked completely broken. The golden child had mortgaged his entire soul to buy his way into high society, only to discover he had married a criminal who bankrupted him and tried to destroy his father to cover her tracks. Chelsea. Jamal choked out, grabbing her arm. Tell me this is fake. Tell me she made this up. Chelsea yanked her arm away. She looked around the room like a trapped animal looking for an exit. The sympathetic audience she had cultivated all week was staring at her with absolute revulsion. Uncle Vernon looked disgusted. Tasha looked horrified. But I was not finished. The financial exposure was devastating. But in crisis management, you never leave the opposition a single inch of breathing room. They had weaponized visual storytelling with that fake internet video. I needed to destroy their narrative with undisputed visual proof. I reached into my tote bag one last time. I pulled out a high-resolution tablet and a wireless connector. It was time for the final act of this dinner theater. Jamal slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed through the private dining room, making the crystal wine glasses rattle. He was desperately trying to claw his way out of the suffocating reality I had just dropped into his lap. "This is garbage!" Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He pointed a trembling finger at the forensic dossiers. "You run a crisis management firm, Aaliyah. You fabricate narratives for a living. You paid someone to mock up these bank statements just to destroy my marriage because you are bitter and jealous. None of this is real." I did not argue with him. Arguing with a drowning man only pulls you under the water. I let him shout. I let him spin his desperate, pathetic web of denial in front of the extended family. While he rambled, I simply reached into the front pocket of my designer tote bag and pulled out a small wireless casting adapter. The private dining room at the Sterling was equipped for high-level corporate presentations. A massive 80-inch smart television was mounted seamlessly into the dark wood paneling at the far end of the room. I walked over, plugged the adapter into the side port, and returned to my seat. I picked up my high-resolution tablet, swiped the screen, and initiated the screen mirror protocol. Jamal stopped mid-sentence. He watched the television flicker to life, his bravado rapidly evaporating as my tablet display illuminated the entire room. "Financial records tell you where the crime happened," I said. Keeping my tone perfectly conversational, but visual evidence tells you exactly who pulled the trigger. I tapped the play button. The screen filled with crystal-clear, high-definition, full-color video. The camera angle looked down from the ceiling of my father's front hallway, capturing the front door, the console table, and the umbrella stand perfectly. The timestamp in the bottom right corner displayed the exact date and time of the incident. The entire dining room fell into a deathly silence. Nobody breathed. Even the waiters who had been lingering near the service doors froze in place. On the screen, Chelsea walked into the frame. The family watched as she frantically rifled through a stack of mail on the console table, her movements jerky and desperate. Then my father stepped into the hallway. Even without audio, the tension was palpable. He held up a piece of paper, the bank statement he had intercepted. I watched the color completely drain from Uncle Vernon's face as the digital Chelsea realized she was caught. Her body language shifted from panic to absolute unhinged rage. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the paper from my father's hands. Calvin stood his ground, pulling the statement out of her reach. Then came the moment that destroyed her forever. On the massive screen right in front of 20 witnesses, Chelsea grabbed the heavy decorative wooden baseball bat from the umbrella stand. She did not hesitate. She swung it with maximum force. The family gasped in unison. Cousin Tasha let out a sharp, horrified shriek. My father raised his arms to protect his head, taking the brutal bone-bruising impact directly across his forearms. He stumbled backward against the wall. Chelsea dropped the bat. It clattered against the hardwood floor. But the assault was not the most damning part of the video. It was what she did next. The room watched in absolute sickening horror as Chelsea walked over to the hallway mirror. She stared at her own reflection. She deliberately dragged her fingers under her eyes, heavily smearing her mascara down her cheeks. She grabbed the collar of her expensive blouse and ripped it downward, exposing her collarbone. She aggressively messed up her neatly styled blonde hair. She took 2 deep, exaggerated breaths, visually practicing her panic. Then, she pulled her smartphone from her pocket and dialed 911. She manufactured the entire scene. She curated her victimhood before the dispatcher even answered the call. I paused the video right on a freeze frame of Chelsea staring into the hallway mirror, her face contorted into a mask of fake trauma, her mascara smeared perfectly down her face. The silence in the private dining room was absolute suffocating and utterly lethal. The illusion was dead. The perfect, progressive, fragile white daughter-in-law had just been exposed as a calculating, violent predator. Chelsea's performative tears, the ones she had been crying just minutes ago to manipulate the aunts and uncles, completely vanished. The fragile victim act dissolved into thin air. Her face twisted into a mask of cornered, panicked rage. She glared at me, her chest heaving, looking like a trapped animal, realizing the cage door had just slammed permanently shut. She had absolutely no defense. She could not claim it was self-defense. She could not claim a misunderstanding. She was caught on high-definition video framing a black elder for a crime she committed. I turned my gaze to Jamal. My brother looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. His skin was an ashen, chalky gray. He stared at the frozen image of his wife on the television screen. The reality of his existence crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. His wife was a degenerate gambler. She had bankrupted him. She had stolen from the father who sacrificed everything for him, and she had violently assaulted that same father, only to turn around and weaponize the police to cover it up. Jamal had thrown away his family, his dignity, and his father's safety for a woman who viewed them all as disposable assets. He was ruined, and he knew it. I did not linger on Jamal. I shifted my focus to the man sitting to his left. Winston, the aggressive family law attorney, was sweating through his $1,000 pinstripe suit. He was staring at the television screen with wide, horrified eyes. He realized instantly that he had been standing on the edge of a legal cliff, and I had just shown him the sheer drop below. "Winston," I said, my voice echoing crisply in the quiet room. He snapped his head toward me, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming semi-truck. I placed my hands flat on the table and delivered the fatal legal blow. If you walk into family court tomorrow morning and file that emergency conservatorship petition based on a fraudulent police report, you will no longer be acting as legal counsel. You will be acting as a willing participant in a criminal conspiracy. If you file that paperwork, I will personally ensure you are named as a co-conspirator in a federal wire fraud and elder abuse RICO lawsuit. I will hand this video, the forensic accounting reports, and the sworn medical affidavits directly to the district attorney and the State Bar Association before you even make it back to your office. Winston did not argue. He did not attempt to defend his clients. He did not say a single word. The survival instinct of a cornered lawyer is a remarkable thing to witness. Winston grabbed the black corporate folder I had given him and shoved it into his thick leather briefcase. He snapped the golden latches shut with a loud, definitive click. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped aggressively against the hardwood floor. He muttered a frantic, barely coherent apology in my general direction, completely ignoring Jamal's desperate, pleading gaze. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. He pushed his way out, letting the doors slam shut behind him, completely abandoning his clients to the slaughter. The legal shield was gone. The family support was gone. The false narrative was completely incinerated. Jamal and Chelsea were entirely alone, sitting at a table surrounded by people who now looked at them with unadulterated disgust. I had backed them into an inescapable corner, and I had brought the entire audience to watch them fall. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open again. It was not the waitstaff returning to clear our plates or offer dessert menus. Two men and one woman in sharp, unassuming business attire stepped into the room. They bypassed the maitre d' and flashed gold badges clipped to their belts. They were plainclothes detectives from the Financial Crimes and Elder Abuse Task Force. When you build an ironclad case in my line of work, you do not just use it for dramatic effect at a dinner table to secure a psychological victory. You use it to secure an arrest warrant. I had not just compiled a beautiful set of folders for my family. I had handed the entire encrypted digital vault, the forensic accounting, the medical affidavits, and the raw video file directly to the district attorney earlier that afternoon. The lead detective approached the head of the table. He stated Chelsea's full name and asked her to stand up. Chelsea froze, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for someone to shield her from the reality of her actions. But Winston had fled the building to save his own legal license, and Jamal was completely paralyzed by the sudden exposure of his financial ruin. The detective recited the charges with clinical, unfeeling precision. Aggravated assault on an elderly person, identity theft, federal wire fraud, attempted extortion. The charges stacked up like heavy concrete blocks, each one carrying mandatory minimum sentencing. Chelsea completely lost her mind. The soft whispered tones and manufactured fragility evaporated into the air. She screamed a harsh guttural sound and shoved her heavy wooden chair backward. She tried to pull her arms away as the female detective stepped forward and secured her wrists behind her back with heavy metal handcuffs. The metallic click echoed loudly against the mahogany walls, sounding like a gavel coming down. The country club princess, the woman who had weaponized her privilege to silence my father, was being marched out of the steakhouse in handcuffs. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her carefully curated image was completely destroyed, and her performative tears could not save her from federal investigators holding banking receipts. The detectives escorted Chelsea through the private hallway, leaving a vacuum of absolute ringing silence in their wake. Uncle Vernon and Cousin Tasha sat perfectly still, their mouths slightly open, too stunned to even whisper. They had come to this dinner ready to condemn me, fully prepared to help lock my father in a psychiatric ward. Instead, they had just witnessed the literal arrest of their golden girl. Jamal was left sitting alone at the head of the table. The reality of his existence crushed him instantly. His wife was going to federal prison. His suburban house was heading into immediate foreclosure. His secret maxed-out credit cards were going to default by the end of the month. He was drowning in 6 figures of offshore debt to shadow creditors that he had absolutely no way of paying. The illusion of his generational wealth was dead, exposed as a pathetic empty shell. Jamal pushed his chair back and stumbled to his feet. He looked at me, then looked at our father. His legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed to his knees right there on the pristine carpet of the private dining room. The arrogance and condescension that had defined his entire life were completely gone, replaced by pure panic. He crawled forward, reaching out with shaking hands toward Calvin. He sobbed, his chest heaving with genuine, desperate terror. "Dad, please!" Jamal begged, his voice cracking horribly. "I did not know. I swear to God, I did not know about the money or the gambling. You have to help me. I am going to lose the house. I am going to lose everything. Please, Dad, I am your son. You have to save me." My father stood up from the table. He looked down at the man kneeling on the floor, weeping at his feet. For 33 years, Calvin had moved mountains to catch Jamal every time he stumbled. He had sacrificed his own peace, his retirement, and his financial security to ensure Jamal never felt the sting of failure. But the father who would have given his last breath for his son had died in that holding cell when Jamal chose to validate a violent lie. Calvin looked down at Jamal with an expression of absolute, unshakable finality. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no sorrow. There was only the cold, quiet distance of a survivor looking at a complete stranger. You stood by while she tried to put me in a cage, Calvin said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the devastating weight of a judge handing down a life sentence. You have no father. Calvin turned his back on Jamal. He did not look back. He walked toward me, offering his uninjured arm. I took it, and together we walked out of the private dining room. We left Jamal weeping on the floor, surrounded by the very relatives he had tried to weaponize against us. They offered him no comfort. They simply stared at the wreckage of the man they used to admire, entirely unwilling to associate themselves with a bankrupt fraud. 6 months later, the dust had completely settled. The legal system moved incredibly fast when handed an undisputed mountain of forensic and visual evidence. Chelsea accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy, highly publicized trial. She was currently serving her sentence in a federal correctional facility, permanently stripped of her designer labels and her aesthetic social media accounts. Jamal was left to face the financial ruin completely alone. Without Calvin's money to bail him out, or Chelsea's performative privilege to hide behind his affluent friends, abandoned him entirely. His house was foreclosed on by the bank. He was forced to file for bankruptcy and took a grueling minimum-wage logistics job just to keep a roof over his head in a cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. The high society he had sacrificed his own father to impress had discarded him without a second thought. I did not just return to my corporate crisis firm. I fundamentally expanded it. The horrific reality of what Chelsea had almost accomplished highlighted a massive systemic vulnerability in how elder care and conservatorships are handled in this country. I launched a dedicated, heavily funded pro bono division within my agency. We employ forensic accountants and aggressive civil rights attorneys specifically to audit and protect elderly minorities from predatory financial abuse, hostile family takeovers, and fraudulent medical conservatorships. We became the shield for those who could not fight back against a biased system. I stood on the glass balcony of my penthouse, a warm evening breeze sweeping across the city skyline. Calvin stood right beside me, holding a cup of herbal tea. He looked healthy, vibrant, and completely safe. His estate was locked behind unbreakable legal trusts that only he controlled, safe from any future manipulation. We watched the sunset paint the clouds in brilliant shades of gold and violet. The peace we had fought so hard for was finally ours. I took a sip of my sparkling water and smiled. Anger burns out. Revenge is exhausting. But verified data is completely immortal. I had proven to my family, to the legal system, and to the city that the most lethal weapon in the room is never rage. It is a woman who knows exactly how to keep her receipts. The greatest lesson from this ordeal is that blood does not automatically grant someone the title of family. True family is built on protection, respect, and unconditional support, not exploitation and gaslighting. When toxic people attempt to weaponize your success or manipulate reality to destroy you, emotional outbursts will only play into their hands. Your ultimate defense is maintaining absolute ice-cold clarity. Protect your peace. Establish impenetrable boundaries and always keep your receipts. You do not have to accept abuse just because it comes from a relative. True power lies in walking away from toxic tables and building your own empire. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your own peace, share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more lessons on reclaiming your power.